What's up guys, welcome back. This is Anime Crossover. You'll be watching What If Naruto Was Mugetsu Part 3. Now, let's begin. The climb through the second story window of the Kurosaki Clinic was a painful and humiliating experience. The rain had intensified, making the siding of the house slippery and dangerous. Ichigo Kurosaki gripped the wooden sill with white-knuckled determination, his arms trembling violently as he dragged his upper body through the opening. He couldn't put weight on his right leg. Every time his calves blistered, raw flesh brushed against the fabric of his torn pajama pants. A blinding spike of white-hot pain shot straight up into his hip, making his vision swim with dark spots. He fell to the floorboards of his dark bedroom, landing with a heavy, muffled thud. He bit down hard on his bottom lip, tasting copper, and desperately hid a groan behind his teeth. If his father awoke to see a chemical burn of this magnitude, the questions would be limitless, and the mundane illusion of their lives would be destroyed. Rukia Kuchiki quietly slipped through the window. She landed softly on the balls of her feet, her school uniform completely dry despite the heavy rain outside. She turned and pulled the window shut, locking it with a quiet click that muffled the sound of the storm outside. Ichigo remained on the floor, chest heaving and eyes squeezed shut. He waited for the throbbing in his leg to calm down from a roar to a manageable scream. "You must elevate the limb," Rukia instructed, her voice hushed and clinical in the dark room. She walked over to his bed, removing the top blanket and rolling it into a makeshift bolster. "Get up, slowly." Ichigo gritted his teeth and pushed himself up onto his elbows. He dragged himself across the floorboards before pulling his upper body onto the mattress. He gently rested his right ankle on the rolled blanket, suspending the burned calf in the air. The cold air in the bedroom hit the exposed, weeping skin, causing him to shiver violently. Rukia removed a small wooden box from her blazer. She flipped the brass latch and opened it to reveal a small glass jar containing a thick, pale green ointment. "What's that?" Ichigo rasped, looking at the jar with suspicion. Rukia explained, "A standard Soul Society coagulant and cellular stimulant," as she dipped 2 fingers into the jar. The ointment smelled strongly of crushed mint and ozone. "It is intended to treat spiritual wounds, but your mortal vessel is already saturated with your own Riryoku and should accept the treatment. Brace yourself. The hollow's acid contains a necrotic spiritual poison. Neutralizing it is usually extremely painful." Ichigo tightened his grip on his headboard's iron frame, causing his knuckles to turn white. He nodded once. Rukia gently pressed her coated fingers against the burn's edge. Ichigo prepared for the fiery agony she had promised. He waited for the poison to produce a violent reaction. However, the pain did not increase significantly. Instead, a deep, soothing coolness spread across his calf. The angry, red inflammation visibly subsided, and the weeping blisters began to dry and tighten within seconds. The sharp, biting pain faded to a heavy, warm numbness. Rukia paused, her eyes widening with shock. She leaned in closer to inspect the wound in the dim light. "This is impossible," Rukia said, furrowing her brow deeply. "The necrotic residue is completely gone. A hollow's acid leaves a distinct, rotting spiritual imprint that actively eats away at a soul's connective tissues. Yours is completely absent. The burn is severe, but it is entirely physical. It is completely clean." She looked up at Ichigo, searching for an explanation in his exhausted and sweaty face. Ichigo let out a long, shaky breath and released his death grip on the headboard. He did not have an answer for her. He only knew that the heavy, silent void in the center of his chest was humming in a slow, steady, and extremely protective rhythm. It felt like a massive, impenetrable barrier between his heart and the rest of the chaotic universe. "Maybe your ointment is that good," Ichigo muttered, allowing his head to fall back against his pillow. Rukia stared at him for a long time, analyzing the anomaly on the bed. She eventually sighed and closed the glass jar, placing it on his nightstand. "Perhaps. Keep the leg elevated. You'll probably walk with a limp for the next week, but the tissue will heal." "Great," Ichigo said with a deadpan expression. "I'll tell my father I tripped over a skateboard." He reached for his canvas school bag that he had dragged onto the floor beside the bed. He unzipped the main compartment. "Okay," Ichigo said, his voice dropping to a serious, uncompromising tone. "Come out." A pair of stubby, bright orange felt paws reached up from the bag and gripped the canvas edge. The stuffed lion's ragged, oversized head slowly pulled itself upward, The single black button eye swept across the dark, cluttered bedroom, taking in the scattered textbooks and posters on the wall before locking onto the Shinigami lying on the bed. Khan scrambled out of the bag, landing on the floorboards with a soft squeak. He dusted off his dingy yellow mane and looked extremely sullen. "This room lacks aesthetic vision," Khan remarked, crossing his stubby arms. His high-pitched voice was lowered to an irritable whisper. "Where are the ruffles? Where are all the plush pillows? Where are the posters featuring beautiful, soft-spoken women? You live in a cave, Kurosaki." Ichigo replied, his brown eyes narrowing. "I live in a house where you are currently a guest. So keep your voice down, or I'll introduce you to the washing machine's heavy soil cycle." Khan froze, his button eye widening in terror. "No, water ruined the stuffing. I'll be quiet. I am a master of stealth." Ichigo let out an exhausted breath, the threat draining his last reserves of energy. He looked down at the ridiculous, filthy plush toy. It was completely absurd that this ratty toy contained the same artificial soul that had thrown itself over a terrified child without hesitation. "Listen to me, Khan," Ichigo said, his tone shifting from threat to quiet, steady contract. "When I have to leave this body to fight, you will take the wheel. You are my decoy. But you're going to follow my rules. You go to school. You sit in my chair. You act just like me. You don't start fights, you don't talk to strangers, and you definitely don't do backflips off delivery trucks." Khan looked down at his stubby toes. He remembered the blinding, terrifying rush of freedom, as well as the agonizing, burning pain that came after. He recalls the boy in the black robes standing between him and the incineration tag. The stuffed lion's single eye reflected the dim light of the street lamp through the curtain. "I act like you," Khan said, his cartoonish voice losing its manic edge. "I keep the meat suit safe. I do not draw attention." "Exactly," Ichigo said, nodding. "You keep my life moving, and I make certain you don't end up in a landfill. Deal?" Khan stood up straighter and pushed his faded orange chest out. He gave a surprisingly crisp, militaristic salute with his stubby paw. "I understand, boss. The decoy is on the job." Ichigo gave the saluting plushie a brief glance before revealing a slight smirk. "Go sleep in the bottom drawer of your desk. Don't let Yuzu see you, she'll try to sew a new eye onto your face." Khan shuddered violently at the thought of a needle and quickly scrambled across the floor, diving into the shadows beneath the wooden desk. Rukia observed the conversation in silence. She walked over to her designated closet corner and closed the sliding door behind her, leaving Ichigo alone in the darkness. Ichigo closed his eyes. The pain in his leg had subsided into a dull, heavy throb, easily pushed aside by the crushing weight of his physical fatigue. The events of the day, the sadistic hollow, the gates of hell, the little boy's weeping soul, swirled around in his mind. But as sleep drew him down, the heavy, silent void in his chest rose up to meet him, swallowing the nightmares before they formed. The inner mindscape, hidden beneath the waking world, was completely still. The Shinigami waters were flawless, reflecting the twilight sky. The massive, sideways glass skyscrapers stood like silent sentinels in the depths. Naruto Uzumaki remained awake in the dark trench. The crippled god of the void hung from rusted chains with his head tilted upward. The reishi bandages around his eyes were dry. The agonizing friction of his own anti-energy had subsided, allowing him to focus with absolute clarity. He successfully neutralized the hollow's toxic residue. He had anchored Ichigo's soul amidst the brutal, chaotic violence of the day. However, his ancient, primordial instincts were now entirely focused outward, projecting beyond the boundaries of the mindscape and filtering through Ichigo's resting physical senses. The spiritual ecosystem in Karakura town was shifting. Naruto could feel it. The chaotic, feral stench of the hollows provided a constant, predictable hum in the city's background. However, a new, distinct signature emerged from the background noise. It was cold. It was frighteningly precise. It smelled like ozone, sterile hospital corridors, and ancient, unyielding pride. Naruto's jaw tightened under the dark fabric. The rusted chains that bound him to the stone pillar groaned as his spiritual muscles contracted involuntarily. He recognized this energy. He knew it in the depths of his hollowed-out, crippled soul. The same energy had reached into his rebirth's divine womb and violently ripped away his ability to absorb and grow. It was the energy of the usurpers. Naruto's internal voice resonated, sending a low and dangerous vibration through the dark water. There was a Quincy within the city, a living descendant of the brother who had disabled him. Unlike the dormant, sleeping fragment of Quincy blood buried deep within the eastern edge of Ichigo's own soul, this presence was fully awake, active, and vigilant. Naruto slowed his breathing, focusing the ancient enmity within his core. He was the immutable present. He couldn't afford the luxury of vengeance, nor could he let his own suppressed hatred seep into Ichigo's consciousness. The boy already carried the weight of the world. He didn't need the grudges of a fractured god to add to his burden. Naruto warned, "Stay in the shadows, Archer. Project the heavy, absolute gravity of your presence entirely inward, to ensure no trace of your existence leaked into the physical world to draw the Quincy's eye. If you point your bow at my anchor, you will experience exactly what nothingness is like." The following morning was a lesson in painful deception. Ichigo experienced stiffness in his right calf, making it uncomfortable to bend his knee. He carefully dressed in his school uniform, making sure his slacks fully covered the bandage Rukia had instructed him to apply. He hobbled downstairs and leaned heavily on the wooden handrail. The kitchen smelled like toasted bread and fried eggs. Yuzu was humming softly on the stove, while Karen sat at the table, aggressively attacking a slice of toast. "Morning," Ichigo grunted, sinking into his chair with a suppressed wince. Karen paused mid-bite, her dark eyes focused on his rigid posture. "You walk like an 80-year-old man, Ichi-ni. What did you do?" Ichigo lied as he picked up a pair of chopsticks. "I fell down the last few steps of the staircase. Tweaked my calf." "Clumsy," Karen said, satisfied with the simple explanation. She returned to the toast. "Oh, Ichi-ni, you should be more careful." Yuzu fretted and brought a plate of eggs to the table. "Would you like me to get the ice pack from the clinic downstairs?" "I'm fine, Yuzu," Ichigo said with a small, reassuring nod. The hairs on the back of his neck rose up. The air behind him shifted. A true warrior does not let a minor injury lower his guard. Isshin Kurosaki roared, lowering from the ceiling rafters directly behind Ichigo's chair, his leg extended in a lethal, descending heel drop. Ichigo did not attempt to stand up. He simply shifted his upper body sharply to the left. Isshin's heel slammed into the chair's wooden seat, barely missing Ichigo's shoulder. The momentum carried the grown man forward, crashing face first into the dining table, scattering napkins and rattling plates. Isshin groaned as he slid from the table to the floor. "My own flesh and blood, so cold and evasive." "Eat your breakfast, old man," Ichigo sighed, his desire for a quiet morning far outweighing his father's antics. The overcast sky matched Ichigo's brooding mood as they walked slowly to school. The pain in his leg was a constant, dull throb, a physical reminder of the violent reality he had stepped into. As he opened the door to his classroom, he was overwhelmed by the usual chaos and noise. He walked down the aisle, his limp barely noticeable, and placed his canvas bag beside his desk. "Good morning, Kurosaki-kun." Ichigo turned his head. Orihime Inoue stood near the front of the room, holding a plastic container filled with what appeared to be a mix of red bean paste and sliced hot dogs. But it wasn't the unusual lunch that piqued his interest, it was her eyes. Naruto felt free of the weight of grief that had been weighing her down for years. Her gray eyes were bright, clear, and unburdened. She gave him a wide, genuine smile and waved enthusiastically. Ichigo experienced a profound easing in his chest. The throbbing pain in his burned calf suddenly seemed insignificant. He'd done it. He swung the massive, terrifying blade, endured the agonizing pain of the acid, and as a result, the girl with the orange hair was free to live her life without a monster breathing down her neck. The burden of the Zanpakuto was crushing, but the outcome was undeniable. Ichigo gave her a small, tired nod. "Good morning, Inoue." He sat down and rested his chin on his palm. 2 rows ahead, Yasutora Sato turned slightly in his seat. Ichigo noticed the massive teenager. Chad did not smile, but instead gave a slow, deliberate nod of deep, unspoken respect. He didn't know the specifics of the invisible war, but he knew the boy in the back row had bled to keep the monsters away. Ichigo returned the nod, forming a quiet solidarity between them. The classroom was loud. It was bright. It was painfully, delightfully normal. However, the normal was fragile. Uryu sits 3 rows to Ichigo's left, near the windows. Ishida did not join in the morning chatter. The bespectacled teenager sat perfectly straight, his pristine white uniform without a single wrinkle. He was holding a small, delicate needle and a spool of thread, calmly and methodically repairing a tiny tear in the cuff of his sleeve. His movements were precise, economical, and completely focused. Uryu didn't look at Ichigo. He did not need to. Uryu's heightened Quincy senses detected the overwhelming spiritual pressure emanating from the orange-haired boy in the back row, even without making eye contact. It was like sitting next to a raging bonfire that was desperately trying to pass itself off as a candle. Uryu tied off the thread with a firm pull. He snapped the extra string with his teeth. Uryu thought, "Enjoy your mundane morning, Shinigami," as he slipped the needle into his breast pocket. His silver eyes were cold behind his square lenses. The grace period is over. It is time to determine whether you are truly worthy of wielding the power you have stolen. The bell rang to start homeroom, but the true test was already waiting in the shadows. Ichigo Kurosaki was used to the sensation of being watched. Invisible eyes had been upon him since he could remember. Pluses lurking in the alleyways, hollows concealed in the thick storm clouds. He knew the ambient, predatory gaze of the spiritual world. It was a wild, chaotic attention, born of hunger or of grief. But the stare which had bored into the back of his neck for 3 days was something else again. It was not hungry. It was a clinical performance. It was the cold, unblinking stare of a surgeon looking at a particularly crude specimen under a microscope. The last bell of the school day rang, breaking the quiet concentration of the afternoon. Ichigo sighed irritably, cramming his textbooks into his canvas bag. He zipped it closed, not hearing the muffled, high-pitched complaint that vibrated from the darkness inside. "Keep quiet, Kon," Ichigo muttered under his breath, throwing the bag over his shoulder. "It smells like despair and graphite in here," Kon squeaked back in his muffled voice. "I want ventilation, fresh air," said one warrior. Ichigo casually jabbed his elbow into the side of the bag and the plushie stopped talking immediately. He stood up and looked around the busy classroom. His eyes flew over the sight of Keigo and Mizuira arguing over video games, over Tatsuki stretching her arms, and finally settled on the row near the windows. Uryu Ishida was already gone. The teen with glasses always left first, disappearing from the classroom with an eerie, silent efficiency. He never spoke except when spoken to, never belonged to a club, and seemed to live only in the peripheral vision of the student body. Ichigo frowned, his hand instinctively going to the center of his chest. It was him, Ichigo thought, his brow darkening into a scowl. "I know it's him. Whenever he walks into a room I get the creeps." Kurosaki. Next to him Rukia Kuchiki materialized, her face a mask of absolute, professional urgency. She did not pick up her textbook or make like it was a normal question. She put her hand flat on the pocket of her blazer where the soul pager vibrated silently. "Sector 2, Rukia said, dark eyes fixed on him. "It's a weak signature, but it's headed toward the residential area. We need to move out." Ichigo didn't think twice. His bones were filled with constant exhaustion, but a heavy, silent void in his chest beat a steady, commanding rhythm. He followed Rukia out of the classroom, hurrying down the busy hallway and slipping out the side exit of the school building. They ducked into the narrow alley in the shadows behind the gymnasium. "Bag," Ichigo commanded, dropping his canvas backpack down to the concrete. He unzipped it and Kon came scrambling out, the ratty stuffed lion gasping dramatically for air. "At last. I was strangling. My synthetic lungs were being crushed by higher calculus." "Shut up and drive." Ichigo thrust his hand into the lion's mouth and jerked the small green pill out. "And remember the rules. If you do anything weird, I'll personally throw you into a woodchipper." "I am the very picture of the average teen," Kon puffed out his faded orange chest and said. Ichigo popped the pill into his mouth and swallowed. The violent, weightless ejection struck him at once. His Shinigami soul erupted from the physical body, the black Shiakusho forming around him, the giant Zanpakuto heavy on his back. His body staggered, recovered its balance, looked up. A huge, manic grin. Kon cracked Ichigo's knuckles and quickly did a rapid-fire stretch of the hamstrings. "Sure, boss. I'm going to walk home so normally people are going to weep at my sheer mediocrity." "Just go," Ichigo sighed, massaging his spiritual temples. He turned his attention away from his hijacked body. He bent his knees, sending the roaring pale blue reishi down into his shoes. He leapt straight up into the air with a concussive boom that cracked the concrete of the alleyway and cleared the roof of the gymnasium. He didn't work on the wires. He ran through the open sky, each footfall leaving a faint blue disk of condensed spiritual energy under his feet. "I've got the heading," Ichigo called down to Rukia, who had to run on the rooftops below, unable to match his aerial mobility. "It is near the river bank. I'll cut it off." He accelerated, the wind shrieking in his ears. Now he could feel the signature of the hollow clearly. It was small, frantic, and smelled faintly of wet garbage and decaying copper. But when he got closer, flying over the rows of tiled roofs and narrow streets, a second feeling came over him. It was the tickle on the back of his neck, times 1,000. It was no longer a feeling of being watched, but a physical pressure. The air temperature plunged suddenly, feeling thin and sterilized, without the usual humidity of the town. Deep down, the pale blue waters of the flooded city of the inner mindscape suddenly froze. It was not a metaphorical quiet. A thin layer of frost spread rapidly over the water. The surface of the spiritual ocean was literally crystallized. Naruto Uzumaki's head snapped up in the bottom of the deepest trench. The crippled god of the void strained against the rusted chains that held him, his reishi bandages black as pitch flaring in the sudden freezing current. Naruto thought, his internal voice echoing with a cold, ancient fury he rarely let surface. Reishi slavery. Naruto knew how what was happening above was working. Like Ichigo, Shinigami drew their power from the depths of their souls, channeling it outward like a roaring furnace. But what Naruto was sensing was the exact opposite. It was a parasite. It didn't make power, it took it. It dominated the spiritual particles in the air violently, twisting the very atmosphere to its whim. It was the very same cosmic principle that Yuwatch used to rip away Naruto's birthright. It was the power of the usurper. Naruto's bright blue eyes glared fiercely through the dark fabric. His anti-energy flared microscopically, desperate to expand, eager to surge upward and erase the arrogant, thieving presence that dared to manifest near his anchor. "No," Naruto commanded himself, his spiritual muscles burning agonizingly as he forced his own power back into his core. "Keep it at bay. Keep your hand covered. Let the archer think he's dealing with a simple Shinigami." Naruto concentrated all his horrible conceptual mass inward, perfectly concealing himself. He wrapped Ichigo's mind in a thick, protective coating of nothingness, shielding the boy's raw, chaotic emotions from being crushed by the sterile, commanding pressure of the Quincy. "Keep an eye on the skies, Ichigo," Naruto sent a tense warning. "The hollow is not the threat today. The threat is the one with the lead." Ichigo skidded to a halt midair, standing on a disc of blue reishi directly above the grassy slope of the Karakura riverbank. The hollow emerged from the trees beneath him. It was a many-legged, monstrous thing, like a giant spider with the wrong number of legs, its bone-white mask clicking madly as it scuttled toward the water. Ichigo reached behind his back and grabbed the hilt of his massive cleaver tightly. He was ready to fall, to bear the full, crushing weight of his blade down on the monster's mask. He never got to do that. Whip. The sound was like a taut wire snapping in a quiet room, an incredibly sharp sound. A blinding, pale blue light shot horizontally across the river bank. It didn't spark. It didn't flag. It flew with a terrifying mathematical precision. The streak of light collided with the center of the hollow's bone-white mask. The impact did not explode. There was no concussive shockwave, no roaring blast of reishi. The hollow simply froze, its many legs locking into place. The creature's entire body melted down violently a second later, becoming a cloud of pristine, glowing blue particles, which dispersed instantly into the cold wind. It was not a cleansing, it was complete and utter annihilation. Ichigo looked at the patch of grass. The giant Zanpakuto still half-drawn. He slowly let his arm fall, brown eyes narrowing as he scanned the opposite side of the riverbank. "You have bad form, Kurosaki." The voice was clear, calm, and carried well over the water. Across the river, a figure in spotless white uniform stood silhouetted against the dying orange of the sunset on top of a concrete utility pole. The evening wind bit sharply at the flowing white cape behind him. Ichigo squinted and watched the figure. He knew without asking who it was. Ishida. Ichigo's voice echoed across the river. He fell from the sky, landing hard on the grassy slope. His woven sandals digging into the dirt. I knew it was you. You that's been sneaking around behind my back. Uryu Ishida adjusted his glasses up the bridge of his nose, square-framed glasses that reflected the light and hid his silver eyes. In his left hand he held a magnificent, glowing bow, made entirely of dense, vibrating blue reishi. I wasn't sneaking, Uryu corrected, his tone dripping with aristocratic disdain. I was watching. I wanted to check if the rumors were true about a new Shinigami fumbling around in my city. And I have to say, I am extremely disappointed. Uryu lowered his bow, the reishi light dispersing back into the air as easily as it had come. Your spiritual pressure is great, but totally unrefined, Uryu continued, absolute superiority in his voice. You leak energy like a broken pipe. And you swing that big hunk of iron like a barbarian. You lack discipline, focus, and elegance. You're a blasphemy to the art of spiritual warfare. Ichigo frowned, setting the huge sword on his shoulder. If you brought me out here to criticize my sword swing, you're wasting my time. Who are you? You're not a Shinigami. Uryu's face hardened. The aloof arrogance was replaced by a deep, simmering intensity. He raised his right hand, rolled back the cuff of his white sleeve, and showed the silver cross hanging from a chain at his wrist. No, I'm not a Shinigami, Uryu said, and the word tasted like poison in his mouth. I'm a Quincy. And I am the natural enemy of all that you stand for. A soft thud sounded over Ichigo's voice. Rukia tumbled onto the grass, her breathing a little quicker than before the sprint. She looked at the teenager in the white uniform across the river, and her dark eyes went wide with absolute, paralyzing horror. Impossible. Rukia whispered, her voice trembling. The Quincy. They're wiped out. The Soul Society destroyed them over 200 years ago. Ichigo looked back at her, his brow furrowing. Destroyed them? Why? 'Cause they don't purify hollows. Rukia stepped forward with urgency. A Shinigami's Zanpakuto expiates a hollow's sins and puts the soul back into the cycle of reincarnation. But the Quincy weapons destroy the soul completely. They destroy it for good. If too many souls are destroyed, the balance of the universe collapses and the worlds of the living and the dead will collide. Uryu snorted across the river. Cross. The balance, scoffed Uryu, silver eyes burning with cold fury. The Shinigami always use the excuse of balance to justify their tyranny. You killed my ancestors to maintain your monopoly on the afterlife. You're slow, you're arrogant, and you're completely superfluous. He pointed a white-gloved finger right at Ichigo. I am the final Quincy. And I'm going to show you that we don't need Soul Reapers to protect this world. I'm going to prove that you Kurosaki are completely obsolete. Ichigo tightened his grip on his sword, the heavy, quiet emptiness in his chest beating a steady warning against the Quincy's overwhelming aura. Show me how. Shooting spiders across the river. Beating you at your own game, Uryu said smoothly. Uryu reached into the breast pocket of his pristine white uniform. He took out a little flat round disc. It looked like a normal piece of clay, except for the jagged red pentagram carved into it. Rukia gasped, her aristocratic demeanor completely shattered. Ichigo. Stop him. That's hollow bait. Empty bait? His muscles tensed up instantly. Ichigo? It's a super dense lure that forcefully pulls hollows out of Hueco Mundo and into the world of the living. Rukia yelled and pulled out her own useless sword. If he breaks it, he will rip a hole in the sky. That's one tough cookie, Kurosaki, Uryu said, holding up the small clay disc in front of him. His voice was full of fanatical certainty. A contest of extermination. The real guardian of this city is the one who kills the most hollows in the next 24 hours. The loser must relinquish his right to battle. Are you crazy? Ichigo bellowed, advancing toward the river. The absolute, blinding need to protect the innocent burned fiercely in his veins. You're going to deliberately bring monsters into the city? There are people living here, normal people? A Quincy never misses. Uryu replied coldly, absolutely confident in his own power. I will not allow one human to die. But you. We will see if your barbaric swinging can match real precision. Uryu made a fist. Creak. The little clay disc shattered in his white glove and a dozen pieces dropped to the concrete utility pole. For an instant the evening wind stopped. The rustling leaves on the riverbank became perfectly still. Then the sky opened, It was not a single break. Gray clouds twisted violently above the sprawling, silent expanse of Karakura town. Dozens of jagged black tears ripped the fabric of reality, spilling a suffocating, rotting copper stench into the atmosphere. The air pressure dropped so quickly that the windows of nearby houses rattled in their frames. 100 frantic, starving shrieks went up at once. Ichigo looked up at the broken sky, the massive Zanpakuto heavy in his hand. The Quincy's cold, accurate arrow had struck the match, and now the whole city was about to burn. The air above the riverbank didn't just change, it shattered. The ragged black tears in the gray clouds were ragged wounds slashed in the throat of the sky. The atmospheric pressure fell away so violently that the surface of the Karakura River rippled outward in frantic, chaotic concentric circles. But Ichigo Kurosaki caught the smell first. It was a tidal wave of rotting copper and stale water and old blood, overwhelming and suffocating. One hollow could reek so much it would make a normal human being ill. Dozens of them, ripping into the world of the living at the same time, created a miasma so thick it tasted like ash on the back of Ichigo's tongue. The sky rumbled. 100 starving, feral voices. Ichigo's teeth ached with the sound, a chorus at a pitch to make his teeth grit. Great bone-white masks began to rise out of the black rifts. Spidery legs, leathery wings, bloated, amphibian arms, grotesque limbs dragged their massive, corrupted bodies through the rips in reality. Ichigo stood on the grassy slope with the massive Zanpakuto heavy in his grasp. His brown eyes were wide, following the sheer volume of monsters flowing into his city. Uryu Ishida stood on top of the concrete utility pole across the river, not looking at the sky. He looked down at Ichigo, a cold, arrogant smirk on his lips. Uryu raised his left hand. Suddenly the bow of the pale blue reishi appeared, vibrating magnificently. He didn't need to draw an arrow. The weapon generated its own ammunition from the spiritual particles in the atmosphere which he was forcibly dominating. Fwip. 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 Uryu fired 3 times in under a second. Condensed arrows of light flew upwards in perfect, mathematical trajectories. They pierced 3 fledgling hollows squarely between the eyes of their bone-white masks. No explosions. There was no frantic fight. The hollows just froze and crumbled into pure blue dust, erased from existence forever. 3 for me, Uryu yelled, his voice cutting through the chaotic shrieks of the other monsters. 0 for the Shinigami. Do try and keep up, Kurosaki. It would be a shame if I had to defend this entire town by myself. Ichigo's jaw tightened, his teeth grinding together. He was pissed at the Quincy's naked, mind-blowingly arrogant attitude. Idiot. There are normal people here. You're treating this like a video game. Uryu didn't bother to reply. He adjusted his glasses with his right index finger, turned his back to the river and vanished. He didn't leap. His movement was a high-speed slip step that used the reishi in the air to blur out of sight in a fraction of a heartbeat. Ichigo stood on the river bank, the sky bleeding monsters into the dying light of evening above him. Ichigo. I'm Rukia Kuchiki. Rukia Kuchiki yelled, drawing her mundane, powerless katana, her hands trembling a little. The hollow bait is ultra-concentrated. It will keep them for hours. We can't allow them to propagate into the densely populated residential sectors or the casualties will be catastrophic. I know, Ichigo growled, his knuckles whitening around the cloth-wrapped hilt of his blade. He didn't give a fuck about the Quincy's sick scoreboard, and his overriding single need was to stop the crying before it even started. He bent his knees and sent the roaring pale blue reishi of his soul down into his woven sandals. Ichigo shot into the air with a concussion-like boom, and dirt and grass clods flew into the river. The flooded city of the inner mindscape was breaking apart under the strain deep down, under the waking world. The bruise of the twilight sky began to mirror the physical world above the skewed glass skyscrapers. Black, jagged rifts gaped across the firmament of Ichigo's soul, pouring the foul, chaotic spiritual pressure of the invading hollows directly into the mindscape. At the bottom of the deepest trench, Naruto Uzumaki grunted, pulling at the stone pillar. The Soul King's heavy, rusted chains pulled taut, biting agonizingly deep into his spiritual flesh. The crippled god of the void felt the immense, crushing flood of hostile reishi descending on him from above. It was sensory overload of pure malice and hunger. Too loud, Naruto thought, his inner voice losing its usual warm hum, becoming sharp and rigid with effort. But the outside threat was only half the problem. The great amount of hollow energy that was streaming through the mindscape was serving as a catalyst. A terrible feral heartbeat began to pound from the far western edge of the flooded city. The water of that sector boiled black and crimson. White, the sleeping hollow in Ichigo's bloodline, was smelling its kin. It was churning, banging its weight against the shallow limits of its sleep, eager to wake and join the slaughter. "You do not," Naruto ordered, his glowing blue eyes blazing hotly under his black reishi bandages. Naruto didn't try to fight the oncoming hollow energy. Instead, he let out the tiny singularity buried within his chest. The concept of the immutable present flared up. A vast, heavy shroud of absolute nothingness unfurled from his chained body, hurtling over the ocean floor, crashing directly into the boiling crimson waters in the west. The second the anti-energy hit the feral heartbeat, the water froze. The inner hollow thrashed violently, but was forcibly suppressed, buried under an immovable mountain of silence. "Sleep, you feral mutt," Naruto thought, panting heavily. Dark spiritual blood oozed from the corners of his bandages. "Not your move." Now that the internal threat was gone, Naruto turned his attention skyward. Ichigo was flying blind, his senses overwhelmed by the sheer quantity of monsters in the sky. If he panicked, if he tried to fight all of them at once, he would burn out his reishi in minutes. Naruto wrapped his quiet, steadying void around Ichigo's core. He filtered the overwhelming cacophony of the swarm, blocked out the distant screams and the chaotic signatures of the monsters across town. Only the sharp, immediate pulses of the hollows directly in Ichigo's path he left. "Don't look at the sky, Ichigo," Naruto sent the warm, steady anchor of his presence straight into the boy's racing heart. "Look at what's right in front of you. One swing at a time. Put your feet down and push." The suffocating panic that had threatened to paralyze Ichigo midair simply disappeared. The noise of 100 monsters was a dull drone, easily dealt with. His vision tunneled, the dense silent void in his chest humming with diamond-hard clarity. He can't save the whole city in one go. But he could save the people in front of him. He made a pale blue disk of reishi under his right foot, kicking off the invisible platform to change his course over a crowded neighborhood of two-story houses. Right below him, a massive hollow had just landed on the roof of a small convenience store. The thing was bulbous and armored like a beetle, but its head had been replaced by a long segmented neck ending in a jagged bone-white beak. Inside the store, the fluorescent lights flickered violently as the hollow's immense spiritual pressure crushed the mundane electrical grid. Behind the cash register, a young clerk and an old customer were huddled, their hands over their ears, oblivious to the unseen nightmare ripping the shingles from the roof overhead. The hollow lifted its beak, ready to breach the ceiling and devour the terrified souls inside it. "Hey!" Ichigo roared, dropping from the sky like a rock. The hollow's segmented neck snapped up, its blank, black eyeholes locking on the falling Shinigami. And charged. Its ragged beak opened like a bear trap. Ichigo didn't avoid it. With both hands he brought the colossal cleaver down, using the momentum of his freefall to multiply the kinetic force of the steel. Crunch. The clumsy, weighty Zanpakuto struck the upper jaw of the hollow head-on. The impact was brutal, a sick collision of dense reishi and spiritual bone. The bone-jarring vibration ran up Ichigo's arms, his shoulders burning with the effort to push through the monster's armor. Finesse was not his game. He depended on the absolute, unyielding need to protect the people cowering below. "Get out of my town," Ichigo roared, sending a huge wave of pale blue reishi into his arms. The blade cut through the bone-white mask, splitting the hollow's head in half. The creature made a short, sharp cry, then vanished in a blinding white light. The purification washed over the roof of the convenience store, turning the heavy armored body to harmless ash that blew away in the evening wind. Ichigo hit the edge of the roof hard and his woven sandals dented the aluminum gutter. His lungs pulled tight with the effort, he was breathing hard. He hadn't a moment to spare. As soon as the beetle hollow vanished, the silent emptiness in his chest throbbed, and his eyes turned toward the east. 2 blocks away, a pair of ape-like hollows with long, razor-sharp fingers were tearing through a small, municipal park, hunting a group of lingering teens who had stayed out past curfew. Ichigo gritted his teeth and swung the huge sword back onto his shoulder and jumped into the air again. He fought with a savage, machine-like efficiency. He didn't count the kills. He didn't care about Uryu Ishida's sick competition. And the sword, when he swung it, was always a desperate and heavy labor. The weapon was too big, the friction of the spiritual battle taking its toll on his stamina, but he would not stop. He sliced an ape hollow in half as it charged a terrified high school student. He smashed the mask of a snake-like monster that was coiled around a telephone pole. Each purification was accompanied by a flash of light, briefly illuminating the dark streets of Karakura town. But for every monster he cut down, 2 more seemed to rip their way through the jagged black rifts in the sky above. Ichigo fell in the middle of a deserted intersection, lungs heaving violently. His black shiakusho was torn at the shoulder, a shallow cut bleeding freely down his left arm. The ambient spiritual pressure had blown the streetlights overhead clean away, and the intersection was only lit by the moonlight filtering through the broken clouds. Kurosaki. Rukia exploded from a nearby alleyway, her breathing ragged as his. She'd been following his movements on foot, using her intimate knowledge of hollow behavior to guide him to the thickest concentrations of spiritual signatures. There are too many, gasped Rukia, halting beside him. She looked up at the sky and her dark eyes mirrored the sheer, apocalyptic scale of the invasion. The hollow bait is functioning as a beacon. Thanks to you and the Quincy, the reishi levels in this town are already abnormally high. It is tempting them in droves. You won't be able to purify them all before they break into the populated apartments. I have to, Ichigo said, his voice hoarse. He leaned on his huge zanpakuto like a crutch and a bead of sweat rolled down his chin. That fool with the bow can't be in 2 places at once. If I stop, people die. You're burning out your mortal reserves, warned Rukia sharply, but with real fear for his safety. A Shinigami's power is based on their spiritual stamina. You are swinging that huge blade with uncompressed raw energy. If you burn out all your Riryoku, then your soul chain will start eating itself to feed the sword. Ichigo wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his bruised hand. His eyes swept down the dark street. Somewhere in the distance, he could faintly hear the muffled sound of sirens. The mundane authorities were trying to deal with the chaos, the broken glass, the weird localized winds, the power outages, but they were utterly helpless when it came to the invisible monsters that were causing it. I don't care about my reserves, Ichigo said, his brown eyes blazing with cold, unflinching blue light. He lifted the heavy sword, the muscles in his back crying out loudly. I told that kid I'd keep the monsters away. I won't break that promise. Before Rukia could protest any further, a harsh, shrill whistle cut through the intersection. Fwip. Fwip. 2 pale blue arrows streaked overhead, barely missing Ichigo's head. They spotted a couple of bat-like hollows diving bombing the intersection from the shadows of a nearby rooftop. The monsters instantly became blue dust. Uryu Ishida appeared on top of a street lamp, his white cape flapping in the wind. He lolled his glowing bow at his side and looked down at Ichigo with the expression of a supreme boar. 11 for me, Uryu smoothly said. I think you're sitting on 4 right now. And there you are, panting like a tired dog. I told you so, Shinigami. Your barbaric methods are primitive. Ichigo's grip on the hilt tightened, groaning against the cloth wrap. The heavy void in his chest surged, anchoring his fury, preventing him from doing something incredibly stupid, like throwing his zanpakuto at the Quincy's head. They are not scores on a scoreboard, Ishida. Ichigo shrieked, the sound full of utter revulsion. Those are souls. You're wiping them out forever just to make a point. Uryu shot back, his silver eyes flashing behind his glasses. I am protecting the living. They had their chance. If they make themselves into monsters, they don't deserve your mercy of purification. My arrows ensure that they can never again hurt another human. It's clean, it's effective. Uryu nudged his glasses up his nose, looking toward the eastern horizon. But it seems I must do your work for you, on account of your indolence, said the Quincy patronizingly. A huge cluster is forming around the commercial district. I'll handle it. Don't trip over your own sword while I'm saving your city. In a blur of high-speed motion, Uryu vanished from the street lamp, leaving behind only the faintest trace of blue reishi. Ichigo stared at the empty space, his jaw clenched so tight it hurt. He's fast, Rukia admitted softly, eyes following the fading Quincy energy. He is a master of ambient reishi and can move and attack without draining his own internal reservoir. He has the absolute edge in a contest of endurance. He's not at an advantage, Ichigo muttered, turning his back on the direction Uryu had gone. He didn't mind the contest. He didn't care about proving Shinigami's superiority. He cared only for the heavy, immediate reality of the people sleeping in their beds, completely unaware of the nightmares clawing at their roofs. "Where's the nearest other Sig?" Ichigo said, his voice becoming professionally calm. Rukia looked at him, and saw the unmovable bedrock of his resolve. She pulled her soul pager out of her pocket, the red screen flashing rapidly. 3 blocks north, said Rukia. Near the elementary school. But Ichigo. 3 blocks, Ichigo interrupted, cutting her off. His knees dipped, the burning in his muscles ignored. A quiet, steady hum of approval thrummed in the silent god in his chest. He ran desperately after the next scream, running up the empty sky like a staircase, and refusing to let the Quincy's arrogance determine the value of a single human life. Ichigo Kurisaki's physical body jogged down the cracked pavement of the residential district, its face twisted into a deep, uncomfortable concentration. Inside the hijacked vessel's cranial cockpit, Khan struggled to remember how to walk like a brooding teen. He kept his shoulders hunched, his hands deep in the pockets of his gray pajama pants, and his brow furrowed into an angry scowl. Left foot, right foot, look annoyed at the pavement, Khan muttered to himself, his voice a low, pitch-perfect imitation of Ichigo's. Don't skip. Don't skip. Teenagers under intense spiritual pressure do not skip. The artificial soul was fully aware of the sensory input in the human nervous system. The air was unusually cold, with a sharp, metallic tang that tasted like sucking on a penny. The gray evening clouds above him were bruised with deep, pulsating black pockets. The hollows were causing chaos in the city, as Khan sensed their presence. His programmed instincts, the core directives instilled in his synthetic soul by the Shinigami who created him, were screaming. Every muscle in the stolen human body twitched with the primal, undeniable desire to run toward the spiritual pressure, to confront and destroy the monsters. He dug his fingernails into his palms and forced himself to walk towards the Kurosaki clinic. Khan reminded himself of his promise, recalling Ichigo's intimidating Zanpakuto. I promise to be the decoy. I keep the meat suit safe. I do not fight. As he turned the corner, the familiar 2-story structure of the Kurosaki household became visible. The blue construction tarp over the ruined waiting room flapped violently in the sudden, erratic gusts of wind blowing down the street. The front door of the house was violently thrown open. Ichigo. Karen Kurosaki stood on the porch, her dark hair whipping around her face. She wasn't wearing her typical confident, tomboyish smirk. She was wielding a wooden broom handle like a club, her dark eyes wide, sweeping the empty street. Khan froze, Ichigo's heart pounding against his ribs. He immediately deepened his scowl, adopting the most apathetic stance he could manage. Yeah. I'm here. What are you yelling about? Karen grabbed his arm and dragged him to the house. Her grip was surprisingly firm. Get in, you idiot. Look to the sky. The weather sirens have not sounded, but the windows are rattling. The wind smells like rotten meat. Something is not right. Khan allowed himself to be pulled, his artificial mind racing. Karen had not fully awakened spiritual awareness. She couldn't see the jagged rifts in the sky or the monsters that flowed through them. But her instincts were razor sharp. She could feel the crushing, unnatural gravity of the disaster sweeping through her city. It's just a weird storm, Karen, Khan lied smoothly, echoing Ichigo's tired dismissal. Do not panic. Where is Yuzu? Hiding under the kitchen table with Dad, Karen said, her voice tight with anxiety. She pushed him to the porch. Dad claims it is just a pressure system, but he is acting strangely. He instructed me to lock the doors. Before Khan crossed the threshold, the hair on the back of his neck stood up straight. The heavy, metallic scent in the air quickly intensified into a suffocating, nauseating wave of sulfur. Khan paused and slowly turned to face the street. Crawling on the roof of the house directly across from the clinic was a nightmare. The hollow resembled a massive, bloated tick. Its bulbous body was a sickly, translucent gray that pulsed with dark reishi veins. Its bone-white mask was small, with a long, needle-like proboscis that continuously dripped a clear, viscous fluid. The monster was not looking at the sky, it was looking directly down at the Kurosaki clinic's porch. It looked at Karen. Despite not seeing the beast, the teenager shivered and tightened her grip on her broom handle. Ichigo, are you feeling that? Khan's programming was violently engaged. The artificial soul was designed for this specific scenario. The need to protect, combined with Ichigo's raw, terrifying physical strength, ignited like a match in a powder keg. Karen, enter the house, Khan ordered. The voice no longer sounded like an irritated teenager. It was a cold, absolute command. What? I am not leaving you out here, the hollow lunged. It didn't jump, but fired itself off the roof like a cannonball, its needle-like mask aimed directly at Karen's chest. Khan did not draw his weapon. He did not have one. He simply stepped in front of Karen and shielded her with his broad back. He planted his bare feet on the wooden porch, directed the dense, residual physical reishi in his blood into his right arm, and delivered a punch. He did not hit empty space. His fist struck the invisible, descending bone-white mask. The enhanced strike was extremely powerful and devastating. The sound resembled a sledgehammer striking a concrete block. The hollow's momentum was immediately stopped. The needle-like proboscis shattered into a dozen pieces, while the bloated, tick-like body was violently deflected. The invisible monster collided with a metal street lamp on the corner. The thick steel pole snapped in half with a deafening screech, hurling sparks into the dark street. Karen screamed, dropping her broom and covering her ears as the street lamp collapsed on itself. Khan stood motionless on the porch, his fist still extended. His knuckles were bruised and bleeding slowly, but the pain was completely overshadowed by the panic that was rising within him. I hit it, Khan thought, his eyes widening. I utilized the body. I used my strength. She saw me accomplish something impossible. He slowly lowered his arm, turning to face Karen. The girl was staring at the ruined street lamp, her chest heaving. She slowly returned her gaze to her older brother. She examined his bleeding knuckles before focusing on the empty space where the invisible force had struck him. Ichigo, Karen said, her dark eyes piercing through the mundane facade, what have you just punched? The inner mindscape was trapped in a state of agonizing tension, miles beneath the chaotic streets. The pale blue Shinigami waters were constantly vibrating. The ocean's surface rippled with the unending, chaotic shockwaves of battles raging in the physical world above. Naruto Uzumaki hung from his rusted chains, head bowed, at the bottom of the deep trench. The crippled god of the void was stretched thin. He could feel the physical vessel, the meat suit, piloted by the lion, fighting. He felt the bruising of his knuckles, the sudden rush of adrenaline, and the younger sister's terrifyingly sharp gaze. Naruto warned, hold your cover, fuzzball. He sent a warning pulse down toward the physical body, calming the artificial soul's panic. She cannot see the truth. Do not hand it to her. Naruto couldn't give his full attention to the physical vessel. The true source of his existence, the Shinigami fighting 3 blocks away, was on the verge of extinction. Naruto felt the terrifying friction of Ichigo's Riryoku through the spiritual tether. The child wielded the massive Zanpakuto like a butcher, relying solely on his own strength. But Ichigo wasn't a machine. He was a newly awakened soul who had received no formal training. His spiritual muscles were torn. His reserves, despite being massive, were hemorrhaging rapidly because he didn't know how to compress them. Naruto's internal voice echoed, "You're swinging too wide, Ichigo," with a clinical and ancient focus. Naruto strained against the Soul King's seals, blood seeping freely from the pitch-black bandages around his eyes. He focused his anti-energy, the immutable present, solely on Ichigo's arms. He did not give him power. Instead, he applied a conceptual brace to the boy's fraying spiritual pathways. He neutralized the suffocating lactic acid buildup in the ethereal muscles, forcing the fatigue into complete and temporary silence. It was a dangerous and unsustainable crutch. Naruto was simply erasing the warning signs of exhaustion, allowing Ichigo to push his soul beyond its structural limits. Naruto grimaced as the chains rattled in the dark water. Just a little longer, kid. Continue breathing. Keep swinging. If you stop now, the sky will fall on top of you. Hado number 4, Byakurai. Rukia Kuchiki's extended index finger emitted a blinding pale blue lightning beam. The Kido spell struck a large, wolf-like hollow in the right shoulder as it streaked across the empty elementary school playground. The impact was insufficient to purify the beast. Without her Shinigami abilities, the spell lacked lethal force. However, the sudden, sharp burn caused the hollow to flinch, its massive jaws snapping shut on empty air rather than Ichigo's arm. Ichigo did not waste the opportunity. As he stepped inside the hollow's guard, he felt a heavy, silent hum in his chest. He thrust the massive Zanpakuto forward, driving the blunt, flat tip of the unrefined blade directly into the bone-white mask. The mask shattered. The hollow screamed before dissolving into a blinding flash of white light and ash. Ichigo stumbled forward, his momentum carrying him past the dispersing ashes. He buried the tip of his sword in the dirt, leaning heavily on the cloth-wrapped hilt. His black shiakusho was soaked with sweat. His chest heaved violently, and his lungs burned with each ragged breath. "That makes 8, Rukia exclaimed, coming to a halt a few feet behind him. She was clutching her side, her synthetic physical body struggling to keep up with the supernatural pace of the fight. But, Ichigo, the signatures aren't thinning. The bait, it is still attracting them." Ichigo slowly lifted his head, staring at the dark, bruised sky. The jagged, black tears in the clouds were increasing. The stench of rotting copper was so strong that it covered his throat like a physical paste. He could hear the distant, overlapping shrieks of dozens of monsters tearing through the residential grids. He tightened his grip on his hilt, leaving his knuckles white. The exhaustion was complete, a heavy, suffocating blanket attempting to drag him down to the dirt. But beneath it, anchored by the silent god in his soul, the desperate need to protect blazed like a cold, blue star. "Where is the archer?" Ichigo rasped, not looking back at her. He stated that he was going to clear the commercial district. "Why is the sky still bleeding?" Rukia glanced down at her soul pager. The screen was a disorganized mess of flashing red dots. "His signature is movable. He's exterminating them at an alarming rate. However, he is a single combatant. The Quincy method depends on absolute precision. He can't fire a wide area blast without endangering the mundane infrastructure." Ichigo took his sword from the dirt and rested it on his bruised shoulder. He is losing his own game. The idiot set a trap too big for him to close. "We cannot help him," Rukia said, her voice tight. "If we abandon this sector, the hollows will attack the nearby apartments. You are the only thing that stands between them and a massacre." "I know," Ichigo muttered. He turned his head, his brown eyes focusing on a new, massive signature falling from a black tear a block away. It was a lumbering, multi-armed monster heading straight for a row of townhouses. Ichigo did not complain. He did not swear. He simply bent his knees, channeling the last of his pale blue reishi down into his sandals, and launched himself back into the dark sky. Uryu Ishida, standing atop an illuminated billboard in the commercial district, tightened the string of his glowing blue bow. His pristine white uniform was no longer flawless. A thin layer of soot and dust covered his cape's shoulders. A small, bleeding scratch ran down his left cheek. His chest rose and fell with quick, controlled breaths, and his silver eyes narrowed with intense, mathematical concentration. Fwip. 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 4 arrows of condensed reishi flashed across the neon-lit skyline. They found their marks with absolute, undeniable accuracy. 4 hollow masks shattered at the same time, causing the beasts to dissolve into blue dust before they even touched the pavement below. Uryu whispered, 32, lowering his bow. He adjusted his square-framed glasses and focused sharply on the commercial grid. By all logical standards, he was succeeding. His kill count was astronomical. His efficiency was perfect. He'd proven beyond a doubt that his methods were superior to the Shinigami's barbaric, sluggish swing. As Uryu looked up at the sky, his cold, arrogant certainty began to waver. The city's air pressure continued to drop. The ambient spiritual particles, the very ammunition he used to make his arrows, were becoming erratic, vibrating violently in the atmosphere. The hollow bait he crushed was not a typical lure. It was ancient and highly concentrated, and he had underestimated the sheer volume of hunger that lay beyond the dimensional veil. Uryu quickly analyzed the variables and concluded that the rifts were not closing. "I'm destroying them faster than the Shinigami, but the number of incursions is growing exponentially. The bait, it is attracting something bigger." A low, deep vibration shook the steel frame of the billboard beneath him. It wasn't a typical hollow shriek. It was a deep, resonant groan that seemed to emanate from the very foundation of the world. It sounded like 2 tectonic plates grinding against one another. The scattered, jagged black tears above Karakura town stopped multiplying. Instead, they started to merge. Uryu's silver eyes widened in shock. The sky ripped open completely. A single, massive rift, perhaps a mile wide, ripped through the gray clouds. The rift was completely dark, a suffocating void that appeared to swallow the city's ambient light. The smell of rotting copper disappeared. Uryu instinctively took a step back, his bow wavering in his hand, as a dense, ancient smell replaced it. It smelled like a graveyard that had been sealed for a millennium. Uryu's arrogance crumbled as he exclaimed, "Impossible! The bait should not have been strong enough to pull a Manos." A pale hand emerged from a massive black rift. The hand alone was as big as a 5-story building. The fingers were long and spindly, wrapped in what appeared to be dirty, ragged white bandages. It grabbed the edge of the dimensional tear and slowly, agonizingly drew an entity of unimaginable size into the world of the living. Uryu stood motionless on the billboard, his bow lowered to his side. His precise, mathematical calculations had totally failed. He wanted to prove that he could protect the city better than a Shinigami. Instead, his arrogance had paved the way for a god of death. The silence on the front porch of the Kurosaki clinic was fragile, suspended by a microscopic thread. Karen Kurosaki stared at her older brother's bruised and bleeding knuckles. A single drop of dark blood swelled on his index finger and slowly fell to splatter on the wooden floorboards. She then looked past him, focusing on the violently bent steel of the street lamp across the road. There was no truck. There was no falling debris. The thick metal pole had crumpled outward, as if hit by a phantom wrecking ball. "Ichigo," Karen repeated, her voice lowering to a harsh, demanding whisper. She did not retreat. She moved closer, her dark eyes devoid of childish naivety. "What did you hit? Don't say it was the wind." The mod soul panicked inside the stolen vessel made of flesh and bone. His artificial programming urged him to fabricate a cover story to maintain the illusion of reality. But Khan was very familiar with the boy whose body he was currently piloting. He was familiar with Ichigo's memories, speech patterns, and the deep, underlying defensive gruffness he used to avoid his family's concern. "I hit a bug," Khan grunted, forcing his bleeding hands deep into the pockets of his gray pajama pants. He rolled his shoulders, revealing a heavy, irritated scowl. "A really large, ugly bug. Now get inside before the storm hits." "A bug does not bend a street lamp," Karen exclaimed, grabbing the fabric of his shirt. "You're hiding something. Ever since that truck allegedly hit the clinic, you've been sneaking out, looking like you haven't slept in a month, and now you're punching invisible walls. What's going on?" Khan opened his mouth, preparing to give another harsh and dismissive order. He never had the chance. The air pressure on the porch collapsed rather than simply dropping. The humid evening oxygen was quickly sucked away and replaced by a suffocating, freezing vacuum. Karen gasped, reaching for her throat. Her knees buckled instantly, unable to bear her own weight against the abrupt, terrifying atmospheric shift. She slammed into the wooden floorboards, her eyes wide with pure, primal fear. She couldn't see the spiritual sky tearing open across town, but her innate sensitivity allowed her to feel the immense, crushing weight of the entity emerging from it. Khan staggered, his enhanced muscles groaning under phantom gravity. The scent spread over the rooftops like a physical fog. It was not the rotting copper odor of a single hollow. It smelled like an ancient mass grave being turned over in the damp ground. It was the stench of 1,000 rotting corpses, compressed and fermented into a single, concentrated nightmare. "Karen!" Khan yelled, abandoning his Ichigo imitation entirely. The artificial soul moved with a desperate, frantic pace. He lifted the girl from the floorboards and threw her over his shoulder like a sack of flour. He dragged her into the clinic's dark hallway before slamming the heavy oak door shut and throwing the deadbolt. Karen shook violently and breathed in short, hyperventilating gasps. "Ichigo, I can't. It's too heavy." "I know," Khan said softly, placing her gently against the wall. He knelt beside her, his stolen brown eyes wide with fear. He looked up at the ceiling, his artificial instincts recognizing the apocalyptic scale of the spiritual pressure that was crushing the town. "It is heavy for me, too. Just stay down. Keep your head down, Karen." He wasn't sure what was going on outside, but he knew the boy in the black robes was there, standing beneath whatever had ripped the sky apart. The inner mindscape screamed from beneath the chaotic streets. The sideways glass skyscrapers groaned loudly, leaving thick spiderweb fractures across the pristine glass panes. The pale blue Shinigami waters did not churn. Instead, they were flattened and compressed into a heavy, viscous sludge by the sheer, overwhelming spiritual gravity pressing down from the physical world. Naruto Uzumaki collapsed to his knees in the deepest trench. The Soul King's rusted chains dug deeply into his spiritual bones. The pitch-black reishi bandages that wrapped around his eyes were completely saturated, with dark, inky blood dripping steadily onto the cold stone pillar. The crippled god of the void gritted his teeth, his jaw locked in agony. Naruto felt a sense of ancient dread as he thought, Manos Grande. He recognized the signature. There wasn't a single soul. It was a horrific cannibalistic amalgamation of hundreds of hollows fused together to form a single, towering column of despair. The intensity of the malice was staggering. It reminded him of the Ten Tails, a mindless, apocalyptic force of nature that lacks a single consciousness. The pressure posed a threat to Ichigo's fragile soul. Ichigo's spiritual pathways were already tearing from exhaustion. If the psychic weight of the Manos was allowed to fully settle on his mind, he would become completely catatonic. Naruto yelled, "Not today!" Into the silence. He didn't pull back, he pressed. The microscopic singularity within his chest exploded outward. The conceptual power of the immutable present erupted not as a shield, but as a massive, load-bearing column. Naruto projected his complete nothingness directly into the crushing gravity of the Manos, forcing his anti-energy to serve as a buffer. He neutralized Ichigo's fear and grief, leaving his mind clear as a diamond. Holding the buffer in place felt like dragging his soul across jagged glass. Naruto said, "Look up, Ichigo." His voice was a warm rumble that cut through the cosmic dread. "It's just a large target. Don't look at its size. Look at the mask. Keep your feet on the ground." In the commercial district, reality was completely disrupted. The massive rift in the gray clouds was over a mile wide. The darkness within the tear was complete, a swirling, pitch-black abyss. After the tear, the entity fully emerged. It was staggeringly massive. It was easily 20 stories tall, towering over the surrounding apartment buildings and commercial high-rises. Its body was completely covered in a heavy, tattered black cloak that obscured its limbs, making it appear like a monolithic pillar of shadow. However, it was the mask that commanded complete terror. The bone-white mask was small in comparison to its massive body, with a long, pointed nose and hollow, black eyes. A spiked, jagged collar of white bone wrapped around its neck. It swayed agonizingly slowly and rhythmically, occasionally turning its head to survey the tiny, insignificant city below. Ichigo Kurosaki stood on the roof of a 3-story municipal building, holding the massive Zanpakuto in his right hand. He was panting, his black shiakusho soaked in sweat and ripped at the seams. His muscles screamed in exhaustion, but his mind, protected by the silent void that held his soul together, was completely, terrifyingly calm. He looked up at the towering giant, his brown eyes narrowing into a dark, unwavering scowl. What is that?" Ichigo rasped the words, which felt like sandpaper in his dry throat. Rukia Kuchiki stood by him. She was not calm. The Soul Reaper trembled visibly and clutched the fabric of her skirt. Her dark eyes widened, and her pupils dilated in absolute, paralyzing horror. Rukia whispered, "Amanos." Her voice cracked. "Amano Grande. Specifically, Agilian class. They're the Abyss's foot soldiers. They do not naturally occur in the realm of the living. They live deep within Hueco Mundo, feeding on one another." She took a shaky step backward, focusing on the towering monster. When hundreds of hollows consume one another, their souls fuse, resulting in this abomination, Rukia explained, the clinical explanation failing to mask her terror. "They're mindless. They're slow. But their spiritual pressure, it's catastrophic. A single Jillian can erase a city block simply by exhaling." The Manos Grande slowly turned its masked face. Its empty, black eyes scanned the commercial district before settling on Ichigo's pale blue reishi, a dense, blazing pillar. It slowly opens its mouth. A high-pitched metallic whine began to build in the back of its throat, sounding like a jet engine accelerating to maximum velocity. A pinpoint of blinding red light began to form between its jaws, sucking ambient reishi from the atmosphere to power the blast. "Sero," Rukia exclaimed. "It's charging a Sero. Ichigo, we need to run, now." She grabbed his sleeve and tried to pull him away from the edge of the roof. You're a newly awakened Shinigami. You lack the necessary training, discipline, and stamina to fight Amanos. If that blast strikes this grid, we will be completely vaporized. Ichigo did not move. His feet remained firmly planted on the gravel roof. He looked down at her hand, clutching his sleeve, and then up at the towering monster. He could feel exhaustion pulling on him. He could sense the desperate, logical truth in Rukia's words. Running was the smart move. Running was the only way to survive. As he observed the red light in the monster's mouth, he noticed apartment buildings behind the municipal structure. He imagined the people sleeping in their beds, completely unaware of the beam of pure, concentrated destruction aimed at their homes. He thought about Karen and Yuzu, who were hiding under a table just a few miles away. If we run, Ichigo said, his voice completely flat and devoid of panic, who stops that blast? Rukia froze and stared at him. Ichigo, you cannot. Ichigo interrupted with a question, his brown eyes dropping to meet hers. If I turn my back and flee, who will protect this city? Rukia swallowed hard as the terrible truth hung in the heavy air. There is no one. There is nobody else. Ichigo nodded once, slowly and definitively. He gently reached over and removed his sleeve from her trembling grip. Then I'm not running, Ichigo said. He aimed his entire body at the Manos Grande. He held the cloth-wrapped hilt of his massive Zanpakuto with both hands, lifting the massive steel blade to rest defensively over his shoulder. The heavy, silent void in his chest pulsed. A deep, resonant throb of absolute approval that flooded his tired limbs with a fresh, cold rush of pale blue reishi. Ichigo ordered Rukia to return. His gaze focused on the bright red light above. I am going to cut that thing down. Uryu Ishida stood 3 blocks away on an illuminated billboard, watching the monster charge its attack. The pristine white cape of his uniform hung limp in the heavy, stagnant air. Quincy's hands were shaking. The magnificent, glowing blue bow in his left hand flickered erratically, as the reishi threatened to vanish. He had broken the bait. He intended to prove the Quincy's superiority and humiliate the Shinigami by clearing the city with mathematical precision. He had calculated the spawning rates. He'd calculated his own stamina. He underestimated the massive weight of the Manos Grande. Uryu felt a cold knot form in his stomach as he realized he couldn't pierce the mask. My arrows will not even scratch the surface of Jillian's spiritual armor. I drew it here. I opened the door and don't have the authority to close it. The realization was completely devastating. The ancient, unwavering pride of his bloodline, the absolute certainty that he was the rightful protector of the living, collapsed into dust. He was not a savior. He was a conceited child who had just signed the death warrant for Karakura town. The red light in Maino's mouth became blindingly bright, casting a harsh crimson glow over the dark city. Uryu closed his eyes and gritted his teeth in frustration. Thud. He heard a loud impact on the billboard walkway's metal grating just feet away. Uryu's eyes popped open. He spun around and raised his flickering bow defensively. Ichigo Kurosaki stood on the narrow metal walkway, bathed in crimson light from the impending blast. The Shinigami was an absolute mess. His black robes were ripped, his shoulder bled, and his chest heaved with long, ragged breaths. He leaned heavily on his massive Zanpakuto, the tip of which rested on the metal grating. But Ichigo was not staring at him. He wasn't demanding an apology or gloating over Quincy's failure. Ichigo looked at Uryu's trembling bow and then at the towering monster. Your arrows aren't strong enough, Ichigo said, his voice low and steady over the high-pitched whine of the charging Sero. It wasn't a taunt. It was a straightforward, pragmatic observation. Uryu's jaw tightened, and his silver eyes flashed with defensive anger. Don't mock me, Shinigami. If you've come to revel in my mistake. Ichigo interrupted with a calm tone. Shut up. He stepped forward and dragged the heavy blade across the metal. I do not care about your pride. I don't care about your deceased ancestors or why you dislike my robes. Look up. Ichigo pointed his Zanpakuto toward the Manos Grande. That thing will wipe out half the commercial district in about 10 seconds, Ichigo said, standing shoulder to shoulder with the Quincy. I have the raw power to hit it, but I can't get there before it fires. You have the precision and range, but not the density. Uryu was taken aback by the orange-haired teenager's lack of hostility. Ichigo didn't see him as an enemy or a rival. He was looking at him, the only other person standing on the front line. Uryu's voice became hushed and tense, as he asked, "What are you suggesting?" Ichigo gripped his hilt with both hands and firmly planted his woven sandals on the metal grating. The roaring, pale blue furnace of his Shinigami Reishi ignited, illuminating the darkness around them. Ichigo spoke, his brown eyes fixed on the red light in the monster's maw. "I'd like you to tie your bow to my sword. Transfer my energy into your weapon. Use my density and fire it with precision." Uryu's eyes widened in complete surprise. "Do you want me to channel your spiritual pressure? The Reishi of a Soul Reaper via a Quincy weapon? It is impossible. The energies are fundamentally opposite. The sheer recoil could shatter your soul chain or rip my arm off." The Sero's high-pitched whine reached an absolute peak. The red light transformed into a blinding, solid sphere of localized destruction, vibrating with force enough to warp the air around it. "Then we should hold on tight," Ichigo growled. He did not wait for an agreement. He pushed the massive Zanpakuto forward, slamming the steel flat against Uryu's glowing blue Reishi bow. "Draw it!" Ichigo roared over the monster's deafening noise. Uryu paused for a microsecond. Then, his survival instinct and desperate need to correct his own catastrophic mistake overcame his pride. He grabbed his bowstring. He did not remove ambient particles from the air. He reached out and dominated the roaring, chaotic pale blue Shinigami energy emanating from Ichigo's blade. The fusion was extremely unstable. Blue and crimson lightning flashed between them. The billboard's metal grating groaned and buckled under the sheer, concentrated power of their combined efforts. Uryu clenched his teeth and pulled the string back, transforming Ichigo's massive energy into a colossal arrow. The Manos Grande charged forward, unleashing the Crimson Sero directly at the billboard. Ichigo yelled, "Fire!" and held the sword steady with his entire back. Uryu released the string. The bow emitted a powerful blue light that pierced the evening sky. It did more than just fly, it displaced the atmosphere itself, creating a localized vacuum as it rushed upward to meet the Manos Grande's descending crimson beam. The two powerful energies collided without a sound. It made it absent, complete, and terrifying. For a single, suspended microsecond, the air above the commercial district simply stopped functioning. All of the oxygen had been burned out. The raindrops fell and vaporized into superheated steam. Then came the shock. It was a deafening, cataclysmic roar, like the Earth's tectonic plates grinding against one another. Uryu Ishida's pale blue hyper-dense arrow flew through the crimson Sero of the Manos Grande and into the night sky. Ichigo Kurosaki was standing on the billboard's metal grating, his boots planted on the steel, and his hands clenched around the cloth-bound hilt of his massive Zanpakuto with bone-crushing force. He was the source of strength. The roaring, chaotic ocean of his pale blue Shinigami Reishi poured through his arms, into the heavy steel blade, and directly into the trembling, glowing bow of the Quincy standing shoulder to shoulder with him. The heat was excruciating. It was like being in front of an open blast furnace. The Sero's red light struggled to push down, while 1,000 fused hollows apocalyptic malice attempted to crush the single, defiant point of blue light. However, the blue arrow did not break. Uryu's mathematical precision sharpened Ichigo's desire to protect the city to a razor-thin point. It was a cosmic dry run. The blue light penetrated the center of the crimson beam. Sparks the size of cars flew from the crash, raining down on the commercial district and hissing on the wet road. The Sero violently split, shearing off red energy and tearing massive smoldering gouges into the sides of the empty office buildings on either side of the street. Push! With a roar that tore at his parched throat, Ichigo poured all of his remaining spiritual reserves into the blade. Uryu clenched his teeth as a thin line of blood trailed from his left nostril. The strain of controlling so many foreign reishi was causing his bow arm muscles to tear. He stayed silent. He simply channeled all of his ancestral pride into maintaining the trajectory. After shearing through the Sero and straight up the red light column, the pale blue arrow landed squarely in the center of the Manos Grande's bone-white mask. The impact sounded similar to a cracked cathedral bell. Julian's huge, monolithic shadow trembled violently. Its throat burst into a deep, agonizing shriek, like hundreds of tortured, overlapping voices screaming in perfect, horrifying harmony. The monster's mask had a large, jagged crack down the left side. Thick, dark purple reishi boiled out of the wound, erupting into the air. The Manos Grande survived. Its body was too large and spiritually dense to be cleansed by a single blow, even one of this magnitude. But it was horribly wounded. The mindless beast recognized a force capable of destroying it. The Manos shrank away. The long, pointed nose turned away from the city, and its massive, bandaged hands desperately reached for the edges of the jagged dimensional tear in the sky. It retreated into the pitch-black depths of Hueco Mundo. When the beast crossed the threshold, the monstrous tear in the gray clouds was violently sewn up. Reality's edges snapped together, leaving the sky smooth, dark, and empty. The Manos' apocalyptic weight had vanished in a single blink. The rain returned, cold and commonplace, splashing on the scorched metal of the billboard. Ichigo fell to his knees, gasping desperately and his chest heaving. He drew his Zanpakuto, and the heavy blade clanged against the metal grating. His black Shiakusho was soaked from sweat and rain. His muscles were completely unresponsive, frozen in paralyzing fatigue. He'd accomplished it. The sky was shut. The monsters were no more. However, the danger was not over. "Kurosaki," Uryu exclaimed, falling to one knee beside him. The Quincy's glowing blue bow vanished into the moist air. His immaculate white sleeve was ripped and scorched as he clutched his left arm. Uryu's silver eyes widened in alarm as he turned to face Ichigo. "Easy there, Kurosaki. Relax your spiritual pressure." Ichigo tried to lift his head, but his eyes blurred. He looked at his hands. They were ablaze. His skin bled a volatile, blinding pale blue. The air around him hissed, and raindrops steamed before reaching his black robes. An uncontrollable, terrible heat rose in his chest and radiated out like a star about to explode. "I can't." Ichigo's vocal cords were vibrating with excessive energy. "My arms are asleep. The valve, it's stuck open." Uryu's face became completely white. They knew exactly what was going on at the Quincy. Ichigo's spiritual capacity defied logic, but he had no training in spiritual regulation. He had completely blown his internal limiters, putting his Riryoku into constant maximum output mode to power the arrow. His soul chain was actively combusting, violently devouring its own foundational reishi to generate power for a threat that no longer existed. He'd literally blow his soul out if he didn't let the pressure build and release. The ensuing explosion would destroy the entire commercial district. Miles beneath the physical world, the drowned city of the inner mindscape was a seething nightmare of disorder. The Shinigami's pale blue waters had become a raging, superheated maelstrom rather than a river. The glass skyscrapers were melting sideways, the reishi structures unable to withstand the sheer, exponential heat of Ichigo's spiritual cascade. Naruto Uzumaki fought an unsuccessful battle at the bottom of the deepest trench. The rusted chains that held the crippled god to the stone pillar were white-hot, burning through his spiritual flesh. Dark, inky blood dripped from beneath his pitch-black reishi bandages, immediately dissolving into the boiling ocean. "Close it! Close it!" Naruto roared, his internal voice cracking under the agonizing strain. He pushed the microscopic singularity of his anti-energy away from himself with all of his might. The conceptual power of the immutable present slammed into Ichigo's raging soul. The immutable present acted like a dampening rod, attempting to force the expanding reishi into a state of absolute nothingness. However, Naruto was structurally limited. This amount of energy needed to be safely grounded. The power that Yhwach had stolen from him at birth was precisely what was required. The capacity to absorb and contain. Naruto was like a man constructing a wall against a tidal wave without the tide. He could only hold up the cascade, not stop it. And the noise awoke the other lodger. From the far western edge of the flooded city, the hollow's feral, chaotic heartbeat, white, began to pound with terrifying rhythm. The red waters rose, stirred by the taste of the impending destruction, eager to claim the rending soul. No. Naruto ground his teeth, pushing a portion of his void completely to the west, trapping the feral beast. He couldn't let the hollow take the wheel with Ichigo so unstable. "Ichigo, let it out!" Naruto cried out, a desperate little warm roar piercing through the agony of boiling water. "Do not try to bottle it up. You are a Shinigami, not a bomb. Vent it. Throw it into the air." Ichigo screamed at the billboard. It was a raw, agonizing sound of pure physical and spiritual destruction. The pale blue light that filled his body burst into blinding brightness. The metal grating beneath his knees began to warp and melt due to the ambient heat. But he was unable to move his hands. He couldn't raise his sword to dispel the energy. He was crippled by his own enormous power. Uryu Ishida observed the increasing Shinigami. The Quincy's ancient, blood-deep pride demanded that he retreat. The Shinigami were his enemies. They had murdered his ancestors. He had sworn to prove that the corrupt, arrogant system they represented was obsolete. If Kurosaki died here, the Quincy would be the only one to defend him. Uryu looked at the boy kneeling on the molten steel. He looked at the teenager who had chosen to save the innocent over a twisted competition. He looked at the Shinigami, who had willingly given him his own power, trusting a sworn enemy to wield it. Uryu gritted his teeth and let out a bitter curse. Uryu hissed, "Kurosaki, you owe me a new uniform." The Quincy did not wince. He charged directly into the Shinigami's spiritual cascade, which was searing and blinding. Uryu used his uninjured right hand to grab Ichigo's black Shiakusho collar with force. Uryu's palm blistered and his white glove burned, but he refused to let go. Uryu's command, "Don't move," cut through Ichigo's scream. Uryu raised his left hand, and the pale blue glowing bow of Reishi reappeared. He was a human lightning rod. He absorbed the wild, surging energy that was leaking from Ichigo's soul and directed it directly into his own Quincy pathways. The pain was unbearable. Using a Shinigami's raw Riryoku through a Quincy's vascular system felt like injecting liquid fire into his veins. Uryu drew the bowstring. He pointed directly up into the dark, rainy sky. Whip. A massive, rough blue energy arrow shot up and ripped through the clouds. Uryu did not stop. He could not afford to aim or hesitate. He served as the Shinigami soul's backfire exhaust valve. Whip, whip, whip. He shot and drew, his left arm becoming a blur of agonizing mechanical repetition. Dozens of massive pale blue arrows sprang from the billboard and flew into the dark night sky. It was like a silent, cataclysmic fireworks show, illuminating the dark rain with blinding flashes of localized spiritual pressure. With each arrow Uryu fired, the suffocating heat emanating from Ichigo decreased. The blinding light that had enveloped the black robes began to fade. "Go on," Ichigo panted, his head bowing and the crippling tension in his muscles dissipating. "Leave it out." Uryu fired another volley, his silver eyes focused and chest heaving from exhaustion. He shot until Ichigo's skin was no longer glowing. He continued firing until the tip of Reishi sputtered, flickered, and eventually vanished in his shaking hand. The torrent of spirituality had ended. Ichigo collapsed sideways onto the wet metal grating, unconscious, the heavy rain removing the sweat and ash from his face. Uryu released the black collar and staggered back. He hit the edge of the walkway and leaned hard against the cold steel to avoid falling. His white uniform was ruined, soaked in rain, sweat, and soot. His left arm was completely useless, hanging down by his side, and the spiritual pathways had been severely damaged by the abrasive flow of Shinigami power. With a trembling right hand, Quincy pushed up his cracked, square-framed glasses. He looked at the teenager who had passed out. The city remained perfectly still. The dense, suffocating weight of the hollow invasion had vanished from the air. And below, the ordinary world slept, unaware that the sky had nearly fallen on them. Uryu did not experience the triumph he expected. He didn't believe he'd proven himself a better warrior. He felt nothing but deep, sick weariness and silent, unwavering respect for the boy in the rain. "You did not win, Kurosaki," Uryu whispered to the empty air, his breath freezing in the cold night. "But, neither did I." Turning away from the Shinigami, his heavy white cape trailing behind him on the wet metal, he began a slow, painful walk down the billboard's access ladder, disappearing into the shadows of the alleyway below. 10 minutes later, a soft thud echoed along the metal walkway. Rukia Kuchiki landed lightly on the grate. She had rushed through the commercial district as fast as her synthetic body would allow, terrified of what she would discover at the epicenter of the Sero conflict. She was searching for a crater. She expected to find the scattered ashes of a slain Shinigami. Instead, she discovered Ichigo Kurosaki sleeping peacefully in the rain, with his massive Zanpakuto by his side. Rukia approached, her dark eyes focused on the melted steel walkway and the fading scorch marks. She watched his chest heave heavily and rhythmically. His spiritual pressure wasn't all over the place or leaking. It had settled into a deep, exhausted, yet perfectly stable hum. She looked at the sky, at the location of the great rifts, and finally at the empty space where the Quincy had stood. She didn't understand the exact mechanics of what had happened, but she did comprehend the mathematics of the disaster. The Shinigami and Quincy stood shoulder to shoulder. They fought off a Manos Grande and both walked away. It was a complete and impossible defiance of centuries of religious tradition. "You're a complete anomaly, Ichigo Kurosaki," Rukia said quietly, pulling her soul pager from her blazer pocket. The screen was completely blank. There was no red dot left in the sector. She was on her knees beside him, holding out her hand to gently shake his shoulder. "Wake up, Ichigo." Rukia's voice was more gentle than it had ever been. "The chase is over. We need to get you back to your ship before your mortal family notices you're gone." Ichigo frowned, his brow furrowed. His eyes remained closed, but his hand moved instinctively, fingers loosely curling around the cloth-wrapped hilt of his sword, reaching for the quiet, steady anchor of the void within his chest. He returned to his body peacefully. Ichigo's Shinigami soul sank into his flesh in the clinic's dark hallway, instantly removing the crippling fatigue. He opened his eyes and leaned heavily against the wall to support himself. His physical body was sitting cross-legged on the floor a few feet away, leaning against the door to the downstairs supply closet. The mod soul looked up and saw Ichigo approaching. All of Khan's manic, desperate energy was gone. He was exhausted from the mundane horror he had just experienced. "They are safe," Khan whispered softly, tiredly, mimicking Ichigo's voice. He pointed over his shoulder to the living room. "Karen and Yuzu sleep on the sofa. Next to them, your father is snoring on the floor. I locked the doors. I kept the meat suit intact." Ichigo looked at the face he'd stolen. He remembered the Sero's blinding red. He recalls the sheer, suffocating terror of standing beneath the Manos Grande. He recognized the crushing, atmospheric despair that had descended on the house while he was fighting. And the artificial soul remained firm, still. He wouldn't run. He'd remained in the hallway, between the dark street and the sleeping family. Ichigo exhaled slowly and deeply. He offered a hand. Khan did not hesitate. He raised his hand, pressed his fingers against the base of his own jaw, and pushed the small green pill back up his esophagus. He spat the pill into his hand before holding it out. The physical body dropped dead weight, slamming into the wall sideways. Ichigo took the pill while watching the small concentrated sphere of artificial reishi. He did not place it in the pink rabbit thing. He did not throw it to Rukia. He unzipped the front pocket of his school bag and took out the faded, ratty stuffed orange lion. He inserted the green pill deep into the cotton stuffing of the plushie's head. The lion shivered, its one black button eye resting on Ichigo's tired face. "Good job, Khan," Ichigo said softly, his voice low and sincere in the dark hallway. "You kept them safe." The plush lion blinked, pressing its short felt arms against its dingy chest. Khan did not scream, for once. He didn't complain about his boat or ask for a six-pack. He simply nodded, a gentle, deep sense of belonging settling over his programmed heart. Khan whispered, "Anytime, boss." Ichigo gently shoved the lion into his bag and picked up his own unconscious body from the floor. He began the excruciatingly slow and silent climb up the stairs to his bedroom. Finally, the sky was clear, with the heavy rain washing away the last lingering smells of copper and sulfur, allowing Karakura to sleep peacefully. There was no sudden sharp pain that announced the physical cost of blowing out one's spiritual limiters. It seeped in like a rising tide of wet concrete, lodging deep in the marrow of the bones, so that even breathing felt like lifting a boulder. Ichigo Kurosaki was lying perfectly still on his mattress. The morning sun speared through the gap in the curtains, aggressively bright, laying a harsh yellow stripe across his gray t-shirt. He didn't want to open his eyes. His eyelids felt as though they had been stitched up. A dull, sickening ache reverberated through every muscle fiber in his arms and back, a phantom echo of channeling an ocean of unrefined reishi into the sky. He gulped. His throat tasted of dry ash and old copper, a sensory ghost from the suffocating spiritual pressure of the Manos Grande. More than anything else, he wanted to burrow farther into the mattress and sleep for a solid week. Last night's chaotic, roaring demands had drained him of his reserves completely, leaving him hollow and brittle and terrifyingly fragile. Clack. The closet door slid on its wooden track. Ichigo did not move. He took deep, measured breaths, hoping the Shinigami would take his fatigue for a coma and leave him alone. Your heart rate is increased. You are awake. The voice of Rukia Kuchiki cut through the quiet room, crisp and utterly unsympathetic. Ichigo groaned, a harsh, jagged sound tearing from his dry throat. He forced his eyes open, blinking in the harsh light. Rukia was standing at the edge of his bed, fully dressed in her neat Karakura high school uniform. Her hair was black and combed to perfection. She showed no sign of the apocalyptic terror they had known under the red light of the Sero. Do you sleep at all? Ichigo cleared his throat, pushing himself up to his elbows slowly. His spine fired, one agonizing burst after another. My synthetic ship needs a little bit of downtime to get back in working order, Rukia said, crossing her arms. Yours, on the other hand, is badly compromised. The spiritual cascade you set off last night pushed your mortal shell well past its structural limits. You are suffering from acute Riryoku depletion. Feels like I got hit by a truck, Ichigo grumbled, swinging his heavy legs over the side of the bed. His feet hit the hardwood floor and a sharp jolt of pain ran up his right calf, a reminder of the acid burn lurking beneath his pajama pants. If it was a truck, it would have been less systemic damage, Rukia said, her dark eyes narrowing in clinical scrutiny. You funneled an obscene amount of power into a Quincy weapon. Those opposing energies should have ripped the chain from your soul. It's a biological impossibility that you're sitting up. Ichigo rubbed his face with his hands, dismissing her analysis. He didn't care about the mechanics of it, why he was alive. What mattered to him was that his sisters were downstairs, safe, and had no idea that the sky had nearly fallen on their heads. He glanced at his desk. The dingy, faded orange plush lion sat smack in the middle of his open math textbook. Khan was standing stock still, his one black button eye staring vacantly at the wall, keeping his promise to act like an inanimate object whenever the real Ichigo was in the room. Ichigo let out a long, shaking exhale and pushed himself to his feet. I need a shower, and about 10 cups of coffee. A heavy, bruised silence deep in the flooded city of the inner mindscape, beneath the dull reality of the bedroom. The pale blue waters of the Shinigami had ceased boiling at last, but the heat was still uncomfortably high. The violent chaotic shockwaves from the Maino's encounter had torn deep, ragged cracks in the bases of the glass skyscrapers angled sideways. Deep in the deepest trench Naruto Uzumaki lay unmoving. The crippled god of the void hanged limp in the rusted chains forged by the Soul King. His spiritual breathing was very shallow, barely disturbing the dark water around him. The pitch-black reishi bandages covering his eyes were completely soaked, the dark inky blood of his overtaxed anti-energy crusted against the fabric. We held the line. Naruto thought, his inner voice not sounding its usual warm, resonant hum. It was a faint, tired whisper, echoing across the empty expanse of the mindscape. The sheer conceptual mass of the immutable present had been the essential buffer, keeping Ichigo's raw, chaotic soul from shattering under the Quincy's desperate pull. The effort cost Naruto dearly, though. His soul, hollowed out by Yuacha's ancient theft, robbed of its ability to absorb and regenerate, felt dangerously thin. Naruto struggled feebly against the heavy iron bands, shifting his weight enough to move the burning friction from his wrists. He turned his awareness outward, beyond the boundaries of the mindscape, checking the perimeter. The far western edge of the flooded city, the domain of the feral hollow white, was frozen, locked beneath the immovable silence Naruto had imposed on it. The beast was furious, frozen in the ice, but it was contained. Naruto dropped his head forward, the cool water washing over his bruised face. You made it through the night, kid. Naruto sent up a weak, steady beat, a silent anchor meant to calm Ichigo's shaking physical hands as he stood in the shower. But you gave a very loud bell. That blast was heard all over the world. Rest when you can. The quiet doesn't last long. The kitchen smelled of burnt toast and steaming miso soup. Ichigo slid into the room, leaning against the doorframe. He'd fought his way into his school uniform, although the buttoning of his white shirt had been an Olympic event. This morning Isshin Kurosaki was not swinging from the rafters of the ceiling. The eccentric clinic director sat at the table reading the morning newspaper with a strange, uncharacteristic furrow of seriousness in his brow. Morning, Ichigo mumbled, pulling his chair out and plopping down with a heavy thud. Karen sat opposite him and immediately her dark eyes flicked to his face. She didn't say a sarcastic hello. She saw the dark circles under his eyes, the stiff tense set of his shoulders, the slight way he kept his weight off his right leg. She remembered the unseen blow on the porch. She recalled the lamppost bowing before the phantom blow. Karen parted her lips, the need for truth warring with the terrifying reality she'd seen. But before she could say anything, Yuzu jumped over to the table and placed a large bowl of rice right in front of Ichigo. "Eat it all, Ichi-ni," Yuzu commanded, her normally soft face contorted with worry. "You look like a ghost. Another all-night study session?" "Yeah," Ichigo lied easily, picking up his chopsticks with a trembling hand. "Big exam, English. Forgot to sleep." Isshin lowered his paper, dark eyes peering over the edge. He didn't launch into a manic, theatrical speech about the strength of youth. He just looked at his son. His gaze was intense, dissecting, cutting right through the mundane excuse. "Make sure you're on your toes today, Ichigo," Isshin said, his voice surprisingly deep and quiet. "The weather reports say the atmospheric pressure is still unstable. All kinds of weird winds blowing through Karakura." Ichigo paused, the chopsticks hovering over his bowl. There was a heavy, silent void in his chest that pulsed slowly, warningly. He met his father's gaze, scanning the older man's face for any trace of hidden knowledge. Isshin just refolded the newspaper and continued reading as if nothing had happened. The walk to school was a test of sheer endurance. The air was crisp and clean from the heavy rains of the previous day. The dull citizens of Karakura town hurried past them. Businessmen ran for trains. Mothers took children to school. They had no idea that only hours ago apocalyptic terror had hovered above their rooftops. Ichigo walked beside Rukia, his head down. His spiritual senses, heightened, were painfully raw. Without the cushion of his usual Riryoku reserves, the ambient, lingering traces of hollow reishi left over from the invasion grated against his nerves like coarse sandpaper. He could smell the ghostly smell of rotting copper on the telephone poles. He could taste the dying terror of the pluses who'd hidden in the alleys during the slaughter. Rukia didn't look at him, her eyes on the pavement ahead. "You have to block out your awareness. Your soul is worn out. Your mind will break trying to process every spiritual trace in this city." "I'm trying," Ichigo growled through his teeth. "It's too noisy." They got to the gates of the school and fell in with the other students who were walking toward the main building. Ichigo dodged through the packed hallways, in a mad rush to the quiet sanctuary of his desk. He rounded the corner to his homeroom, eyes trained on the floor linoleum. He ran right into someone that was coming the other way. The blow wasn't strong, but Ichigo's tired muscles screamed in protest and he took a clumsy step backward. "Watch where you're going, Kurosaki." The voice was crisp, cold, aristocratic with contempt. Ichigo lifted his head. Standing before him was Uryu Ishida, in his clean white uniform. The bespectacled kid stood perfectly stiff, his silver eyes flashing over the square lenses of his glasses. But keen eyes of Ichigo caught the inconsistencies at once. Uryu's left hand was swathed in thick white medical tape, the stark cotton completely covering his palm and wrist. His skin was laughably pale, with a sickly grayish cast that spoke of a serious lack of sleep. The Quincy were suffering just as badly as the Shinigami. Ichigo didn't pout. The blinding anger that normally accompanied their interactions was nowhere to be found, incinerated by the devastating heat of the Sero they'd fought off together. "God, you look like crap, Ishida," Ichigo said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Uryu's jaw clenched and his unharmed right hand clenched into a fist at his side. The Quincy's pride required a sharp, cutting retort. It was a demand for him to reassert his superiority, to mock the Shinigami's clumsy pace, his raw, unrefined aura. But Uryu remembered the blinding, scorching heat of Ichigo's spiritual cascade. He remembered the teenager's willing throwing of his own soul to the breaking point, to fuel the arrow that saved the city. Between them was the undeniable arithmetic of the disaster. They had failed their respective ideologies, and survived only by deserting them. "My condition doesn't matter," said Uryu, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose with his right index finger. "And don't think our temporary alignment is a truce, Shinigami. I merely intervened to fix a simple miscalculation that would have damaged the mundane infrastructure. My total contempt for your species remains." Ichigo sighed, short and tired. He had no energy for a philosophical debate on dead ancestors and spiritual monopolies. He had to sit down. Ichigo said flatly, Whatever helps you sleep at night. He circled around the Quincy, his shoulder lightly grazing Uryu's uninjured arm, and moved on toward the classroom. Uryu stood in the hallway, staring ahead at the lockers, which were crowded. His silver eyes narrowed, deep, bitter frustration struggling with quiet, undeniable respect. He turned his head slightly and saw the orange-haired teen hobbling away. "You're an idiot, Kurosaki," thought Uryu, with a throbbing, rhythmic burn in his left hand from the heavy bandages. "You have the power of a god but you bleed like a man. But, you didn't run away." The afternoon dragged by in a haze of regular pain. Ichigo slept through social studies, math, and literature. Sensei Ochi yelled at him twice, smacking a textbook against his desk, but he just couldn't keep his eyes open. The heavy, silent void in his chest was like a dark, comforting blanket, and it pulled him down into a dreamless, healing sleep whenever the teachers weren't looking. When the last bell rang, Ichigo was the last one to stand up. He slung his canvas bag over his shoulder, and the muffled squeak of the stuffed lion pressed against his hip. He left the classroom quite determined to go straight home, fall on his bed and not move until Monday morning. Rukia was waiting for him at the shoe lockers. She didn't appear impatient. She was not holding her soul pager, nor demanding immediate patrol. She stood there, motionless, her back rigid, her dark eyes looking out the glass doors at the gray, overcast sky hovering over Karakura town. The air was so thick around her. "Are we done?" Ichigo came to stand beside her and asked. He leaned against the metal lockers, dying to stretch his legs. "Tell the pager to quiet down. Tell me there are no monsters today." Rukia didn't look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the clouds. "The local hollows have pulled back," Rukia whispered, her voice sinking to a terrified hush. The Manos Grande carried a spiritual weight that the lesser beasts were terrified of. They've retreated back into Hueco Mundo or they're hiding deep within the banal infrastructure. The town is quiet. Ichigo frowned, feeling the deep, underlying dread that radiated from her synthetic vessel. "Then why do you look like you're going to be executed?" Rukia's eyes drifted shut, a deep old fatigue washing over her aristocratic features. "Because a Manos Grande doesn't pass through the dimensional veil without being noticed," Rukia said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "The spiritual dislocation is too big. It hits every sensor in the Seirei. The Central 46, the captains of the Gote 13. They all know what went down here last night." She opened her eyes and looked straight at him. The pure, unadulterated fear in her eyes made Ichigo's blood run cold. "They know a Shinigami illegally used a huge amount of Riryoku in order to fight back," Rukia whispered. Her hands were trembling a little. "And they know I haven't filed a report in more than a week. It won't be calm for long, Ichigo. The Soul Society is coming." The phrase hung in the air between them, thicker than the humidity of the overcast afternoon. The Soul Society is coming. Ichigo Kurosaki felt a sharp rush of adrenaline as he stared at Rukia Kuchiki, temporarily overriding his exhaustion. He was unfamiliar with the exact geography of the spiritual world. He had no idea what the captains' names were or how the Seirei was organized, but he recognized the expression in her eyes. It was the frantic, trapped look of a soldier who had just realized they were standing in the middle of a minefield. "What are you coming for?" Ichigo inquired, his tone dropping to a low, defensive gravel. He pushed his back away from the metal shoe lockers, his muscles protesting violently. "To give us a medal. We stopped that giant thing from turning the commercial district into a crater." Rukia closed her eyes, a bitter smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. She shook her head, her black hair swaying against the crisp collar of her school jacket. "Ichigo, the Soul Society does not award medals for unsanctioned miracles," Rukia said, opening her eyes. The dark irises were entirely devoid of hope. "The laws of the Gote 13 are absolute. Shinigami are strictly forbidden from transferring their powers to humans. It is a felony of the highest order, and the punishment is not reprimand, but execution." The word struck Ichigo like a physical blow to the stomach. He felt a violent throb in the center of his chest, which had previously been silent. The deep, fundamental desire to protect those around him erupted instantly, washing away his fatigue. He took a step toward her, his brown eyes narrowing into a fierce, unwavering scowl. "Are they going to execute you?" Ichigo demanded, his voice echoing slightly through the school's empty entrance hall. "To save my family? To save this town?" "They will execute both of us," Rukia said, her voice dropping to a whisper. She looked down at the linoleum flooring. I committed a crime of transfer. You committed the crime of receiving. Ichigo, you are not considered a hero by the Central 46. You're an illegal anomaly. A thief carries a stolen weapon. They will dispatch an enforcement unit to recover my powers, and they will erase you to restore the balance. Ichigo clenched his fists, his bruised knuckles throbbing along with his fast heartbeat. The sheer bureaucratic cruelty was incomprehensible. They'd bled. They had nearly torn their souls apart to keep the monsters at bay, and their reward was a death sentence from the very people who were supposed to guard the gate. Let them come, Ichigo growled, his jaw hardening into a stubborn line. I'm not giving this power back. Not while I still have hollows crawling around my house. If they want to execute us, they'll have to go through my sword. Rukia gazed up at him. She could see absolute, unwavering conviction burning in his pale blue spiritual aura, even as his physical body trembled from exhaustion. He meant every word. He would stand in front of an entire army if he believed it was necessary. This was exactly what terrified her. You are a fool, Rukia said softly, her voice concealing the sudden, desperate resolution forming in her own mind. She turned away from him and pushed the glass doors of the school open. Go home, Ichigo. Rest your mortal vessel. We'll make a plan tomorrow. Ichigo frowned, noticing the cold distance in her tone. He followed her out into the damp afternoon air, the canvas bag with the terrified stuffed lion rubbing against his hip. Rukia, wait. I told you to go home, she snapped, not looking back. Her pace quickened, and her synthetic loafers clicked sharply against the concrete. I have patrol routes to verify. I don't need a crippled, exhausted person slowing me down. Ichigo was too tired to confront her after the harsh dismissal. His vision was blurring at the edges, and sleep had become an absolute, undeniable biological imperative. He stopped on the sidewalk and watched her disappear behind a brick wall. The silent void in his chest hummed a low, mournful note, which he lacked the strength to interpret. He turned and started his agonizingly slow, limping walk back to the Kurosaki clinic. The inner mindscape, hidden beneath the waking world, was completely still. The twilight sky above the glass skyscrapers was calmer than the night before, with no jagged black rifts. The pale blue Shinigami waters were flat and glassy, reflecting the soul's quiet exhaustion. Naruto Uzumaki emerged from the trench with glowing blue eyes. The crippled god of the void didn't sleep. While Ichigo's physical body eventually collapsed onto his mattress, pulling the heavy blankets up over his chin, Naruto clung to the rusted chains forged by the Soul King. The pitch-black reishi bandages around his eyes were dry, the bleeding had stopped. He listened. Naruto's spiritual awareness extended beyond the mindscape, filtering through the quiet, rhythmic breathing of the sleeping teenager. He pushed his senses through the dark, rain-soaked streets of Karakura town. Naruto's internal voice resonated with the cold stone pillar behind him, indicating that she was leaving. He sensed Rukia's synthetic signature leaving the clinic quickly. The Shinigami was deliberately putting distance between herself and Ichigo. Naruto recognized the tactic right away. It was a classic, tragic maneuver in which a soldier attempted to divert enemy fire away from a civilian. She intended to flee, hoping that the Soul Society would follow her and leave the anomalous human boy out of the crossfire. Naruto felt a deep sense of empathy for the foolish girl. They don't want only you. They want the power he has. They refuse to stop until the ledger is clean. Naruto's focus on her fading signature was interrupted by a sudden sensation. The town's spiritual ecosystem maintained a constant level of air pressure. It did not warp or twist like the arrival of a hollow. It snapped. It was a perfectly clean and terrifyingly precise tear in the fabric of reality. It sounded like a sliding paper door was thrown open with tremendous, disciplined force. Naruto strained against his heavy chains, his spiritual muscles tightening. The reishi spilling into the city from the tear was unlike anything Ichigo had encountered before. It was not the rotting, chaotic malice of a hollow. It wasn't the cold, sterile dominance of the Quincy. The reishi was structured. It was dense, polished, and extremely sharp. It was like walking into a room filled with drawn, perfectly honed steel blades. It was the unmistakable, overwhelming signature of trained, elite assassins. Naruto's voice echoed through the trench, conveying a cold, ancient severity. He felt two massive signatures pass through the Senkaimon, the Soul Society's dimensional gate. One was a raging, aggressive fire, restrained by military discipline. The other was a suffocating glacier of icy, aristocratic authority. Naruto sensed two signatures sweeping the city like searchlights, indicating their intent to find him. If they detect Ichigo's Shinigami power, they will quickly attack the Kurosaki clinic. Ichigo was physically broken. He was soundly asleep. If he awoke and attempted to fight these two entities in his current state, they would not only defeat him, but slaughter him. Naruto did not hesitate. The microscopic singularity deep within his chest erupted violently. The conceptual power of the immutable present, the absolute void, emerged from his chained body. He did not project it into the physical world. He drew it completely inward, wrapping a massive, suffocating blanket of absolute nothingness around the core of Ichigo's being. He took the roaring, pale blue furnace of the boy's Riryoku and completely turned it off. He erased Ichigo's spiritual footprint, transforming his soul into a cold, mundane rock in the middle of a vast, barren desert. The effort was agonizing. Suppressing such a powerful force was like attempting to hold the lid down on an erupting geyser with bare hands. Dark, inky blood immediately began to seep from beneath Naruto's bandages, dissolving into the pale blue water. Naruto commanded the void, "Sleep, Ichigo," with his voice straining under immense conceptual pressure. "Stay in the dark. Let the hunters walk by." The night air was bitterly cold, with a strong scent of damp asphalt and exhaust fumes. Rukia Kuchiki ran. She didn't use the sidewalks. She moved across the residential district's rooftops, her synthetic loafers making no sound on the ceramic tiles. She clutched a small cloth bundle to her chest, one of the few meager supplies she'd taken from the Urahara shop. Her breath formed small white clouds before her face. She was pushing the Gigai to its absolute physical limit. She needed to be as far away from the Kurosaki clinic as possible. She knew Senkaimon would be open tonight. The delay caused by the Maino's encounter served as the final grace period. If the enforcement unit discovered her standing next to Ichigo, the boy would undoubtedly draw his massive sword to protect her. He would fight until he died. Rukia's dark eyes focused on the shadows ahead, thinking that if she surrendered quietly, the retrieval could be considered successful. They may not bother scanning the city for the anomaly. The hope was based solely on the assumption of bureaucratic inefficiency. However, it was the only play she had left. She jumped across a narrow alleyway and landed silently on the flat, tar paper roof of a small apartment complex. She did not take another step. The hair on the back of her neck stood straight up. The reishi in the air suddenly froze, securing her synthetic lungs in place. The shadows cast across the roof by the nearby chimney did not appear natural. They looked too deeply, too sharp. "You've grown slowly, Rukia." The voice did not originate from behind her. It came from directly in front of her, echoing from the deep shadows on the roof's edge. Rukia's heartbeat stopped. She recognized that voice. It was a rough, abrasive growl with a familiar, dangerous edge that she remembered from her days in the Rukongai slums. A figure emerged from the darkness. He was tall, muscular, and dressed in the black robes of a Soul Reaper. Unlike Ichigo's plain uniform, this Shinigami wore a white, sleeveless haori of a seated officer. His fiery red hair was pulled back into a tangled, spiky ponytail, held in place by a pair of expensive sunglasses resting on his forehead. Dark, intricate tribal tattoos covered his brow, sweeping down to his aggressive, predatory eyes. Despite wearing a standard zanpakuto, the hand resting on the hilt appeared to be ready to draw it. Rukia whispered, "Renji," as the cloth bundle slipped from her numb fingers and hit the tar paper roof with a soft thud. Renji Aburai, lieutenant of the 6th Division, did not smile. His gaze swept over her strange, human outfit, the pleated skirt, blazer, and synthetic skin. His tattooed face contorted with disgust. "Look at you," Renji sneered, his voice full of anger and betrayal. "Wearing a gigai. Hide in the world of the living like a common criminal. Do you know how much trouble you've caused, Rukia?" Rukia clenched her trembling hands into fists at her sides. She raised her chin, desperately trying to summon the aristocratic poise of the Kuchiki clan. "My assignment was extended due to unusual hollow activity," Rukia said, her voice tight but unwavering. "I was doing authorized reconnaissance." "Do not lie to me," Renji barked, taking a quick, heavy step forward. His spiritual pressure erupted into a massive, roaring, aggressive red aura that caused the air on the rooftop to vibrate. Last night, the sensors in the Seirei went crazy. Ameno's Grande signature is followed by a massive, unofficial release of Shinigami Riryoku, and it was not yours. He drew his Zanpakudo precisely 1 inch from the scabbard. The sharp clack of metal against wood was deafening in the quiet night. You gave your powers to a human, Renji charged, his eyes narrowing into deadly slits. You violated the ultimate taboo. Where is he, Rukia? Where is the thief? There is no thief, Rukia lied calmly, standing firm in the face of his spiritual pressure. The Riryoku signature was a flaw in a temporary combat item I obtained from Urahara Kazuki. I'm the only Shinigami in this sector. Renji gave her a long, silent stare. The wind howled across the roof, sweeping his red hair around his face. Then a terrifying presence emerged. It did not flare as aggressively as Renji's. It fell from the sky like a glacier. The temperature on the rooftop dropped below freezing. Frost formed instantly on the tar paper's edges. The spiritual pressure was so dense, so finely refined and controlled, that it did not feel like an aura. It felt like the physical weight of an ocean was pressing down on one point. Rukia's breath was caught in her throat. Her knees buckled under the newcomer's sheer, authoritative weight. The captain of the 6th Division appeared behind Renji, seemingly out of nowhere in the moonlight. Byakuya Kuchiki was the epitome of noble perfection. He wore a white captain's haori over his pristine black robes. A delicate, extremely expensive white scarf, the Kenseiken, was wrapped around his neck, and intricate white headpieces kept his long, dark hair in place. His face was a flawless, stunning mask of cold, unfeeling stone. He didn't look at Renji, he stared directly at Rukia. Byakuya remarked, "You disgrace the name of our clan." His voice was soft and melodic, but devoid of warmth and mercy. "Lieutenant Abarai, restrain the prisoner. We will execute the human, then return to the Soul Society to sentence her." Rukia dropped to her knees on the frozen roof, her head bowed in submission. She did not draw her sword, she didn't try to flee. "Please, Ni-sama," Rukia begged, her voice cracking under the terrifying weight of her adopted brother's presence. The human had nothing to do with it. I imposed the power on him. Execute me, but keep him out of it. Byakuya didn't blink. He slowly placed his hand on the ornate hilt of his Zanpakudo. "The laws of the Soul Society are not subject to your emotional pleas," Byakuya stated firmly. "The anomaly will be erased." A mile away, in the dark, quiet bedroom of the Kurosaki Clinic, the teenager sleeping on the mattress gasped. Ichigo's brown eyes popped open. The suffocating blanket Naruto had wrapped around his soul could hide his spiritual footprint from the hunters, but it couldn't sever the deep tether forged between Ichigo and Rukia after the Zanpakudo pierced his chest. He felt more than just her terror. He could feel the cold, lethal steel of the executioners pressing against her throat. Ichigo threw the heavy blankets off his body. The agonizing pain in his muscles, the exhaustion in his bones. All of this was instantly consumed by a blinding, roaring furnace of pure, absolute need. He disregarded the laws of the Soul Society. He didn't care about the captains or the executioners. He grabbed the faded orange stuffed lion from his canvas bag and violently shoved the green pill down his throat. The violent ejection was instantaneous. The chalky peppermint taste of the green pill had barely settled on Ichigo Kurosaki's tongue before a localized, concussive shockwave tore through his core. His physical body's heavy, bruised flesh was instantly stripped away, left behind as his Shinigami soul burst into the dark, quiet bedroom. His physical body threw itself backward awkwardly, snagged on the edge of the mattress. A second later the stolen brown eyes snapped open. Khan drew in a quick, panicked breath, his synthetic hands clutching the bedsheets. Ichigo didn't look back, he gave no orders to the stuffed lion, wasted no breath on goodbyes. The heavy, silent void in his chest, that had been acting as a suffocating, protective blanket for the last hour, was ripped open by the sheer, blinding magnitude of Ichigo's need to protect. He could feel the cold, deadly edge of the executioner's sword against the signature of Rukia. Ichigo grabbed the hilt of his enormous Zanpakudo, wrapped in cloth, and slung the giant slab of steel over his shoulder. He kicked off the hardwood floor, pouring his pale blue reishi into his woven sandals, and shot straight through the shattered window frame, rocketing into the freezing night sky. Miles below the waking world, the flooded city of the inner mindscape churned violently. The absolute, conceptual nothingness that Naruto Uzumaki had wrapped around the boy's soul was destroyed from the inside out. The pale blue Shinigami waters erupted, like a geyser tearing through solid rock, tearing through the heavy blanket of silence. Naruto bit down on his teeth as he lay at the bottom of the darkest trench, his head snapping back as the rusted chains forged by the Soul King tightened agonizingly. He broke the seal. Naruto's inner voice boomed, a rough vibrating rumble of deep concern. The crippled god of the void did not pull the blanket back down. It couldn't be. Ichigo's raw, chaotic emotion was a roaring furnace of desperate, suicidal loyalty. The protective silence fell away, and the mindscape was flooded with the crushing, oppressive signatures of the two Soul Society hunters. Naruto's glowing blue eyes squinted behind his pitch-black blood-soaked reishi bandages. He could sense the lieutenant's aggressive roaring fire. It was wild, vicious and hungry, the energy of a brawler. But it was the second signature that let the cold, ancient dread settle heavily in Naruto's hollowed-out chest. The captain. Like a bottomless ocean of liquid nitrogen, perfectly still. It was an authority so absolute, so refined it didn't need to flare to impose its gravity. Naruto knew what that power felt like. It was the same terrifying, impenetrable wall of disciplined lethality that he had encountered when standing before Kagaya Otsutsuki or Uchiha Madara. It was the energy of something that had spent centuries perfecting the kill. You can't beat him, Ichigo, Naruto thought, a deep, aching helplessness tightening in his chest. You don't have the lungs to breathe in that cold. Naruto released the chains. He relaxed his spiritual muscles, and let the dark water flow over his bruised face. He wasn't able to give Ichigo power. He couldn't give him a miracle of speed to pass the captain. To project the immutable present into the physical world to wipe out the Shinigami would shatter Ichigo's fragile, untrained soul completely due to the sheer conceptual friction. He had to allow the boy to play. He had to let the lad down. I can't stop the blade. Naruto threw his weighty, quiet presence downwards, funneling his anti-energy into a thickly wound spring within the depths of the trench. But I can pick up the pieces. I do not want to break your soul, kid. Just get through the first strike. A freezing wind moaned along the narrow, dark streets of the residential district. Ichigo didn't run across the rooftops. He streaked across the sky as though the empty air were a solid road. His lungs were on fire. His spiritual muscles, already torn and frayed by the apocalyptic battle against the Manos Grande, protested with every pulse of reishi he forced into his legs. He turned a corner of a high-rise apartment building, brown eyes searching the shadows below. One broken street lamp spilled a garish, flickering yellow light that washed the street. Rukia Kuchiki was down on her knees, on the cold asphalt. Her head was down, her synth hands relaxed in her lap, completely submissive to the terrible weight of the two men facing her. But she wasn't the only one bleeding. Uryu Ishida was crumpled against a brick wall a few feet away. Quincy's fresh white uniform was destroyed, drenched in dark crimson blood. There was a great jagged cut diagonally across his chest. His broken glasses, square-framed, lay scattered on the pavement beside him. Semi-conscious, he was breathing in shallow wet gasps. He had felt the hunters coming, and in a surge of stubborn, suicidal pride he had tried to cut them off. He'd not lasted 10 seconds. Standing over the blood Quincy was the tall red-haired Shinigami with the tribal tattoos. Renji Aburai loosely held his Zanpakuto in his right hand. Uryu's blood was spattered on the silver blade, and it dripped slowly down onto the asphalt. Pathetic, Renji spat, kicking the shattered remnants of Uryu's glasses out of the way with the toe of his sandal. A Quincy. I thought you rats were dead. You don't even have the spiritual pressure for this to be a decent warm-up. Renji turned his predatory, aggressive gaze back to Rukia. He lifted his blade, the flat of the steel, to his shoulder. Look what happens when you try to hide, Rukia. Renji snorted coldly, his voice vibrating with a rough, grating anger. People get hurt. For the last time, now. Where's the human who stole your power? If you don't tell me, I'll rip the answer out of this archer's ribs. Rukia didn't look up. Her voice was hollow, broken, whispering. Like I said, Renji. There is no man. I did it alone. Liar. Renji roared, moving in on her, slashing down with his blade in a fierce, menacing sweep meant to scare her into breaking. He never finishes the swing. Clang. The impact was deafening. It rang down the empty street like a bomb exploding in a cathedral. Renji's eyes opened wide with utter surprise. Between him and Rukia, a huge, colossal slab of dark steel had suddenly appeared, stopping the downward momentum of his blow. The kinetic force of the block caused a localized shockwave. The asphalt under them cracked, spiderweb cracks radiating in every direction. The harsh yellow light of the street lamp flickered and shattered, showering glass down onto the pavement. Ichigo Kurosaki was the middleman between the prisoner and the executioner. He gripped the cloth-wrapped hilt of his massive zanpakuto with both hands, his boots firmly placed on the ruined street. His black shiakusho was drenched in sweat. His chest heaved, his breath misting in the freezing air, but the blue fury in his brown eyes was cold and unrelenting. "You talk too much," Ichigo growled, a low, gravelly threat that vibrated through the thick steel between them. Renji stared at the orange-haired teenager, his tattooed and furrowed brow deep in utter confusion. He glanced at the ridiculous, outrageous size of the blade that was blocking his own, then at the huge, roaring bonfire of raw spiritual pressure that was leaking out of the boy's body. "Who the fuck are you?" Renji leaned his weight against his hilt, trying to force Ichigo back. "I'm the guy that's going to wipe that stupid look off your face," Ichigo snapped back. He didn't try to muscle out the older Shinigami. Ichigo turned his wrists, pointing his massive sword downward. He used the momentum to shove the red-haired lieutenant forward, then violently rammed his left shoulder into Renji's chest. The physical blow caught Renji entirely off guard. He staggered back, the soles of his sandals scraping against the asphalt, to keep his balance. "Ichigo!" Rukia screamed, her head snapping back. The resignation in her eyes was instantly replaced by sheer, blinding terror. "No, flee. You cannot fight them. Get the fuck out of here." "Shut up, Rukia!" Ichigo snapped, without taking his eyes off Renji. He shifted his weight, the huge sword plunged deep into the ground before him. "You think I'm going to run away and let them drag you back to be hung? I give no fucks for your stupid laws. Tonight nobody dies." A few feet away, standing perfectly still in the freezing shadows, Byakuya Kuchiki slowly opened his eyes. The captain of the 6th Division had not moved a hair during the exchange. He wore the white haori over his perfect black robes, his face a perfect mask of cold, unfeeling stone. He eyed Ichigo, judging the broad, oozing spiritual pressure with the disinterested, clinical eye of an entomologist examining an irritating bug. "So," Byakuya's voice sliced through the freezing air. It was soft, melodic and had a suffocating, absolute authority that made the hairs on the back of Ichigo's neck stand up. "This is exception. A boy playing with a stolen sword." Byakuya did not draw his sword. He did not even change his position. He only looked at his lieutenant. "Renji. Get him out. His vulgar spiritual pressure is disgusting to look at." Renji's face broke into a savage, feral grin. He gripped his zanpakuto in both hands, crouching low and ready. His spiritual pressure came alive, roaring and wild, tasting of ozone and blood. "With pleasure, Captain," Renji growled, his eyes fixed on Ichigo. "I'm going to enjoy bringing that big kitchen knife down a notch." Ichigo didn't wait for the lieutenant to get the ball rolling. The heavy, silent void in his chest swelled, pouring a desperate, biting adrenaline into his exhausted limbs. He leapt forward, the concrete splitting beneath his sandals. He swung the massive cleaver back over his right shoulder and with all the weight and momentum he could muster he brought the devastatingly horizontal sweep down straight on Renji's ribs. Renji didn't even blink. He struck the strike outright. Clang. The two blades met again and a blinding shower of orange sparks poured down over the dark street. The impact sent a jarring, agonizing shockwave straight up Ichigo's arms. His muscles, already shredded from the Manos Grande, cried out in protest. Gritting his teeth, tasting copper, he pushed harder, attempting to use the sheer mass of his zanpakuto to crush the lieutenant's guard. "You're a heavy bastard, I'll give you that." Renji grunted, sliding his boots an inch back on the asphalt. He stared at the massive blade against his grin widening. "But you're a mess. You're just hitting a club." Renji twisted his blade with practiced ease, deflecting the heavy steel. He moved inside Ichigo's guard with blinding speed. Before Ichigo could bring the enormous sword back to defend himself, Renji slammed the pommel of his Zanpakuto into Ichigo's sternum. The physical blow was devastating. Ichigo's breath came out in a whoosh. He was thrown back, skidding over the rough asphalt. He slammed into the brick wall of the alleyway and his massive sword clattered loudly to the floor beside him. Ichigo! Rukia yelled. She tried to stand but failed as the weight of Byakuya's passive spiritual pressure held her on her knees. Ichigo coughed violently, spitting a wad of blood on the pavement. He pushed himself up, dark spots swimming before his eyes. The pain in his chest was choking, but the fear of letting the girl kneeling in the street down was much worse. He reached out and his shaking fingers found the hilt of his sword, wrapped in cloth. He used the blade as a crutch, dragging himself back to his feet. "You don't understand, do you?" Renji mocked, heh, resting his blade on his shoulder as he walked slowly toward the struggling teenager. A Zanpakuto isn't just a big piece of metal. Its size is meant to be in tune with the density of your spiritual pressure. Yours is enormous, for you have no control whatever over your own soul. You're just bleeding power all over. Renji halted a few feet away, his predatory eyes narrowing. Renji sneered. "You're no kid, Shinigami. You're nothing but a stray dog with a stolen bone." Ichigo wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He looked at Renji, then past the lieutenant, then over the cold, unmoving glacier of Captain Kuchiki's eyes. He met his match. He was tired. He started to bleed, but as he felt the heavy, silent void in his chest humming a slow, steady rhythm, Ichigo realized he didn't care what the odds were. He didn't care for technique, or these men and their centuries of discipline. "I don't care what you call me," Ichigo rasped, raising the colossal blade once more. His pale blue reishi flared, splashing light into the dark alley, fighting the suffocating cold of the executioners. "I'm not letting you take her." The sound of steel colliding rang out, a sharp, abrasive screech that cut through the freezing night air. Ichigo Kurosaki pushed forward, grinding his boots against the alleyway's ruined asphalt. Every muscle in his arms screamed, saturated with the toxic, burning buildup of lactic acid. His lungs felt as if they were full of crushed glass. He pressed his weight against the cloth-wrapped hilt of his massive Zanpakuto, desperate to push the red-haired lieutenant backward. Renji Aburai did not move. The Shinigami wielded his standard katana with both hands, meeting Ichigo's blade with a perfectly angled block. Renji was not straining. A vicious, mocking grin stretched across his tattooed face, his predatory eyes gleaming with the excitement of the slaughter. "Is this it?" Renji taunted, his voice harsh and vibrating over the grinding steel. "Is this the legendary power that set off the alarms in the Seirei? You are nothing but brute force, kid. You have the spiritual pressure of a bonfire, but you swing your sword like a drunk lumberjack." Renji twisted his wrists with incredible speed. He did not attempt to overpower Ichigo's massive blade. Instead, he slid his katana down the flat of the giant cleaver, completely redirecting Ichigo's momentum. Ichigo stumbled forward, losing his balance. Renji delivered a brutal kick to Ichigo's knees while he was still recovering. Ichigo slammed his chin into the freezing asphalt. He tasted warm, metallic blood right away. "Ichigo!" Rukia Kuchiki exclaimed, her voice cracking. She was still pinned down a dozen yards away, paralyzed by the sheer, suffocating gravity of Captain Kuchiki's passive spiritual pressure. "Stop! Don't get up! If you surrender, they may show mercy." "Mercy?" Renji laughed, a sharp, barking sound that had no humor. He took a slow, deliberate step toward the fallen teenager, resting his blade casually over his shoulder. "There is no mercy for a thief." He assumed the power of a noble. His presence is an insult to the Gote 13. The inner mindscape, located beneath the waking world, shook violently. Shinigami's pale blue waters were tinged with dark crimson clouds. Every time Renji's blade or boot struck Ichigo's spiritual body, a phantom echo of the trauma rippled through the ocean, cracking the foundations of the glass skyscrapers that stood sideways. Naruto Uzumaki hung from rusted chains at the bottom of a dark trench, his jaw locked in a rictus of absolute concentration. The crippled god of the void bled. The pitch-black reishi bandages that covered his eyes were completely soaked, with the dark, inky liquid dripping steadily into the swirling water. The sheer conceptual effort required to keep the boy's soul from fracturing under the physical and psychological abuse was excruciating. Naruto's internal voice, "He's too fast," Ichigo, resonated through the dark water. It wasn't a criticism. It was a cold, clinical assessment of the battlefield. Naruto recognized the lieutenant's fighting style. It wasn't just pure speed. It was the economics of motion. Renji had spent decades drilling basic sword katas into his muscle memory, so he didn't have to think about parrying or striking. In contrast, Ichigo was entirely reliant on his blinding, desperate need to protect. Naruto's anti-energy tightly encircled Ichigo's vital organs, like a flood trying to pass through a needle. He conceptually locked the boy's spiritual heart and lungs in place, preventing the blunt force trauma from resulting in a fatal internal hemorrhage. "You cannot outfence him. Stop attempting to match his blade," Naruto told the void, his voice a steady, warming rumble against the freezing terror of the alleyway. "You are a formidable weapon. Utilize your mass. Use your gravity. Make him carry your weight." In the alleyway, Ichigo drew his hands beneath his chest. He dug his fingers into the cracked asphalt. He ignored Rukia's desperate pleas. He wasn't concerned with the Gote 13, or the laws of a society he'd never seen. He was only concerned about the terrified girl kneeling in the street, and he was certain that if he did not stand up, she would be executed. Ichigo pushed himself up, arms trembling violently. He used the hilt of his massive Zanpakuto as a crutch to help his battered body stand up. Blood dripped from his chin, staining the white sash on his black shiakusho. "You're a stubborn stray, I'll give you that," Renji said, his eyes narrowing. The lieutenant's amusement was fading, giving way to a cold, abrasive irritation. "Why don't you stay down? You're bleeding out. You don't know her. She's a Shinigami who has used you as a battery. Why are you throwing away your life?" "Because she saved my family," Ichigo said, his breath misting in the cold air. He lifted the massive cleaver, the muscles in his back wailing in protest. "She threw herself in front of a monster to protect my sisters. That means she is under my protection. And I don't care if you're a lieutenant, captain, or king of your stupid ghost world. You're not touching her." Uryu Ishida, crumpled against a brick wall, slowly opened his eyes. The Quincy was severely wounded, with a deep slash across his chest bleeding slowly into his ruined white uniform. He couldn't raise his arms, but his silver eyes, free of his shattered glasses, were fixed on the orange-haired Shinigami standing defiantly in the middle of the street. Uryu thought, "You idiot," as he coughed bitterly. "You are outclassed in every metric. You're swinging raw iron at refined steel. But your resolve is unwavering. You genuinely believe you can break a mountain with your bare hands." Renji's face darkened, and his tribal tattoos twisted into an aggressive scowl. "Under your protection?" Renji said, his voice dropping to a lethal hiss. "You arrogant, little brat. You believe that because you have a large sword, you can withstand the true power of the Gote 13? I'll show you the distinction between a genuine Shinigami and a thief." Renji raised his left hand, slowly running 2 fingers along the unsharpened back edge of his katana. His fiery spiritual pressure did not just flare, but violently condensed. The air around him hissed and tasted strongly of ozone and burning metal. "Howl," Renji said, his voice resonating with ancient authority, "Zabumeru." The transformation occurred instantly. Renji's katana's smooth steel cut through the illusion of its mundane shape. The blade widened, separating into thick, jagged sections of heavy steel held together by a flexible, heavily reinforced spine. It no longer resembled a sword. It resembled a massive, bladed whip, with razor-sharp, saw-like teeth. Rukia let out a gasp, leaving her face pale. A Shikai has released his Zanpakuto. "Ichigo, run." Renji did not wait. He whipped his wrist forward at terrifying, explosive speed. Zabumeru's segmented blade elongated and shot across the alleyway, resembling a viper. The jagged teeth ripped through the freezing air, aiming straight for Ichigo's chest. Ichigo lacked the speed to dodge. He attempted to use his massive Zanpakuto as a shield. Zabumeru struck Ichigo's blade with a loud crang. However, the sword was not solid. This was a whip. Zabumeru's heavy, segmented blades bent around Ichigo's block. The jagged teeth snapped forward, arcing over the top of the massive cleaver and biting viciously into Ichigo's left shoulder. Ichigo let out a sharp, breathless grunt as the steel ripped through his black shiakusho, slicing deeply into his spiritual flesh. Renji abruptly yanked his wrist back. The whip's saw-like teeth ripped out the wound, spraying crimson blood into the dark street. Ichigo was violently thrown off balance, spinning backwards due to the sheer, tearing force of the retraction. He crashed onto the asphalt and rolled twice before coming to a stop near the shattered street lamp. Ichigo! Rukia screamed, struggling against the invisible weight that held her down. Renji slowly reshaped the segmented blade into a solid, jagged sword, the steel dripping with Ichigo's blood. He started walking toward the fallen teenager, his boots crunching against the broken glass. "That's the reality of the world, Kurosaki," Renji said, his voice devoid of sympathy. "Your raw power means nothing if you don't know the name of your own soul. You're fighting blindly. Now, stay on the ground, and I'll finish the job quickly." Ichigo lay on his side, his left arm completely numb, and a warm pool of blood spread rapidly beneath him on the cold asphalt. The pain was blinding. The roaring, jagged fire threatened to consume his entire consciousness. His lungs tightened, refusing to draw in the cold air. The stark, terrifying reality of his own mortality descended on him. However, he felt a sense of darkness creeping into his vision. The void in the center of his chest was heavy and silent. The pulse did not indicate adrenaline. It did not provide a magical surge of healing. It simply pulsed with a vast, immovable silence. It took the roaring fire of his pain and the suffocating terror of his impending death and conceptually erased them. "You are still breathing," the ancient hum echoed through his soul, cutting through the panic. "You're still holding the sword. The ground is cold. Stand up." Ichigo's right hand twitched. His fingers curled and wrapped tightly around the cloth-wrapped hilt of his massive zanpakuto. He didn't simply stand up. He pushed himself off the blood-soaked asphalt, his boots digging into it. His left arm hung limply at his side, the sleeve of his shiakusho completely ripped, but he raised the massive cleaver with his right arm, resting the heavy steel on his uninjured shoulder. Renji paused, his tattooed brow furrowing in genuine disbelief. "Are you insane? I just carved your shoulder to the bone. You should be shocked." "I told you," Ichigo growled, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that shook the cracked asphalt below them. He raised his head. His brown eyes were no longer simply focused. They were burning. The pale blue Shinigami Reishi that had been leaking erratically from his body abruptly condensed. The air around him did not simply hiss, it roared. The surrounding rain and mist began to vaporize as soon as they came within 3 feet of his body, repulsed by the sheer, staggering density of his spiritual pressure. Ichigo repeated, "I'm not letting you take her." It wasn't a desperate promise anymore, it was an undeniable fact. Renji's eyes widened. For the first time since the fight began, the lieutenant's face showed genuine concern. The spiritual pressure emanating from the bleeding teenager was astronomical. It exceeded anything Renji had ever experienced from a seated officer. It was raw, unpolished, and absolutely terrifying. His Ryotsu is spiking again. Renji thought as he tightened his grip on Zabumaru's jagged hilt. How does he have anything left? Die! Renji roared. Trying to anticipate the surge, he whipped his wrist forward, sending Zabumaru's segmented, saw-like blade slicing across the alleyway, aiming directly at Ichigo's head. Ichigo did not attempt to block. He did not attempt to use the flat of his blade as a shield. He remembered a steady, silent command from within his soul. "Make him carry your weight." Ichigo stepped into the path of the striking whip. As Zabumaru's jagged teeth snapped forward, Ichigo unleashed a brutal diagonal slash with his massive zanpakuto. He did not aim at Renji's body. He aimed directly at the lieutenant's shikai, which had an extended, flexible spine. Ichigo's heavy blade smashed into the center of the striking whip. The impact was catastrophic. Ichigo's pale blue reishi was extremely dense and exploded upon contact. It didn't just deflect Zabumaru. It completely annihilated the shikai's attack. The jagged segments of Renji's blade were violently redirected, sending the whip backward with terrifying, uncontrollable force. "What?" Renji exclaimed, his eyes widening in horror as his own weapon was deflected. Ichigo did not stop. He capitalized on the momentum of the clash, pouring every drop of his roaring, blazing spiritual pressure into his legs. The asphalt beneath his boots shattered, leaving a small crater as he launched himself forward, closing the gap between them in a fraction of a heartbeat. Renji retracted Zabumaru, desperately pulling his arm back to form a strong blade for defense. He was way too slow. Ichigo stood right in front of him, his brown eyes filled with cold blue fire. The massive cleaver was already in motion, rising in a devastating, unstoppable vertical arc. Renji struggled to raise his weapon in a panicked block. Crash! Ichigo slammed his blade into Renji's guard. The physical weight and blinding spiritual density of the strike were both absolute. Renji's block has collapsed. The massive steel cleaver slashed through his defense, tearing a deep, jagged gash across Renji's left shoulder and slicing upward, leaving a shallow, bleeding cut across the lieutenant's tattooed forehead. The force of the blow knocked Renji completely off his feet. The red-haired Shinigami was thrown backward like a ragdoll, flying through the freezing air until he crashed violently into the alleyway's brick wall. He collapsed to the ground, his Zanpakuto clattering against the pavement and a thick stream of blood running down his face. The alleyway became completely silent, except for Ichigo's ragged, heavy breathing. Ichigo stood in the center of the ruined street, his colossal sword held loosely in his right hand and the tip resting on the asphalt. He was bleeding profusely. He was exhausted beyond mortal comprehension. But he'd won the exchange. He had broken the executioner's guard. Rukia stared at him with awe and dread. She wasn't focused on Ichigo's victory. She was looking at the shadows behind him. Enough. A single word was not yelled. It was said softly, with the melodic, cold precision of dropping a shattered glass onto a marble floor. The temperature in the alleyway didn't just drop, but died. The ambient moisture in the air instantly froze, leaving delicate, terrifyingly sharp crystals of ice on the brick walls and ruined asphalt. Ichigo's breath was caught in his throat. The heavy, silent void in his chest emitted a sudden, violent throb of absolute, primal warning. Byakuya Kuchiki stood 10 feet to his left, untouched by the chaos of the battle. The captain of the 6th Division did not draw his sword. He stood perfectly straight, his pristine white scarf blowing gently in the cold wind. His flawless, aristocratic face looked at Ichigo with profound, chilling boredom. Ichigo attempted to direct his massive Zanpakuto towards the new threat. He tried to force his exhausted muscles to move, raising his blade to defend himself. Byakuya took one step forward. He didn't run. He didn't blur with speed. To Ichigo's exhausted, blinking eyes, the captain simply ceased to exist in one place and appeared directly in front of him. Senka was a highly advanced flash step technique that completely bypassed human visual processing capabilities. Ichigo froze. He couldn't swing his sword. He couldn't even take a breath. Byakuya's cold, empty eyes stared directly into Ichigo's soul. The captain's right hand no longer rested casually at his side. 2 fingers of his pristine white glove were extended, lightly pressing against the center of Ichigo's black shiakusho, directly above his spiritual heart. "You're loud," Byakuya said softly, "and you're slow." Byakuya's fingers moved before Ichigo could register it, and before the silent god in his soul could create a buffer to protect him. The captain struck the Seketsu and Hakasui, the spiritual pillars of a Shinigami, with pinpoint accuracy. There were no sounds of tearing flesh. There was only a quiet, terrifying snap that echoed in the center of Ichigo's mind. Ichigo's power remained a roaring pale blue furnace. It was abruptly, violently extinguished, as if a switch had been flipped in the dark. Ichigo Kurosaki collapsed in the bloody snow as his eyes rolled back into his head. Stay tuned for more. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this video. I'm thrilled you watched the video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe for even more exciting content coming your way soon.